It is winter, 1340. In a cold forge on the edge of a mountain village, a blacksmith pulls a glowing axe head from the coals. The iron he is working was smelted the slow way, by hand, from ore most people would have thrown away, and it will never rust. 600 years later, that axe head sits in a museum, its edge still clean and bright. Meanwhile, the steel tools you bought 2 springs ago are already flaking orange in your shed. We were promised modern metal was better, stronger, cheaper, stamped out by machines instead of shaped by hand. But the smiths who came before us understood something about iron and about tools that the factory quietly forgot. They made iron that shrugged off rust for 1,000 years. They carried a single blade that did the work of 6 modern tools. They forged edges that grew sharper the more you used them, and gave bare iron a black rust-proof skin that cost nothing but fire and oil. They swung the adze and the draw knife, 2 tools that could shape an entire house and that no power tool has ever truly replaced. Not because they had better technology, because they understood the metal and the work all the way down. Here are the medieval tools and ironwork methods that still outlast almost everything hanging in your garage today. In a museum vault, there is an iron axe head forged in the year 1200, 800 years old. Pick it up, examine the blade. The surface shows a dark patina, but the metal underneath? Solid, strong. No deep pitting, no structural decay. Now walk outside to your garden shed. There is a steel axe you bought 2 years ago. The head is already spotted with orange rust. In 5 years it will be so corroded you will throw it away. How is this possible? How can something made with primitive tools in a clay furnace outlast precision-engineered modern steel by centuries? The answer is not magic. It is chemistry, accident, and a lost understanding of iron that we sacrificed for convenience. Before we dive into this forgotten science, type "built to last" in the comments if you believe we have lost something valuable in our race for cheap, disposable tools. I want to know, does this resonate with you? Drop that comment now. Section 1. The Modern Rust Problem. To understand why medieval iron resisted rust, we must first understand what modern steel really is. When you buy a tool today, you are getting what metallurgists call mild steel. It contains roughly 0.25% carbon, 0 slag, 0 phosphorus. We call this progress. Medieval wrought iron was fundamentally different. It contained only 0.05% carbon, but up to 2% slag, those glassy impurities left over from smelting. It also contained phosphorus, sometimes as much as 0.25%, an element that came naturally from the ore. Modern steel production deliberately removes both the slag and the phosphorus. Why? Because they make the steel harder to work with in factory processes. Slag-free steel can be rolled into sheets faster. Phosphorus-free steel welds more easily in assembly lines. We optimized for manufacturing speed, not for durability. But here is what we did not understand until recently. Those impurities were not bugs. They were features. When modern steel rusts, the corrosion digs straight down. A speck of moisture touches the surface. Oxygen reacts with iron. Rust forms. That rust is porous, and it traps more moisture, which creates more rust. The corrosion burrows deeper, following the grain boundaries of the metal like roots following cracks in concrete. A microscopic crack in modern steel becomes a highway for rust. Nothing stops it. Within months, surface rust becomes structural damage. Medieval wrought iron had a secret weapon, slag stringers. During the forging process, as the blacksmith hammered the bloom of iron, tiny threads of glassy slag were stretched throughout the metal. Under a microscope, it looks like wood grain, thousands of microscopic glass fibers running through the iron matrix. When rust started on wrought iron, it would hit one of these slag barriers. The glass fiber would blunt the corrosion, forcing it to spread sideways instead of penetrating deep. Studies have shown that this network of slag inclusions disperses rust into a thin, stable surface layer instead of allowing deep, destructive pitting. The result? An axe head that forms a protective patina and stops corroding instead of crumbling into orange powder. If you are learning something valuable here, hit that like button. It costs you nothing, but it helps this knowledge reach people who need to hear it. Quick tap, then we continue. Section 2. The accidental genius of phosphorus. Medieval smiths did not understand chemistry. They did not know what phosphorus was, but they knew which rocks made the best iron. In marshy areas across Europe, iron ore formed naturally in bogs. This bog iron ore was easy to gather. You could practically rake it off the ground, but it had something special: high phosphorus content. When bog iron was smelted, that phosphorus stayed in the metal, and when that phosphorus-rich iron slowly corroded over decades, something remarkable happened. The phosphorus helped form a dense, stable film of protective oxides on the surface. This film sealed the metal from moisture and oxygen, dramatically slowing further rust. This was a happy accident, a beneficial impurity in the ore. The smiths did not know why bog iron worked better, they just knew it did. The most spectacular example of this effect stands in Delhi, India. The Iron Pillar of Delhi is over 1,600 years old. It weighs more than 6 tons, and it has almost no rust. For decades, scientists were baffled. How could iron survive that long? Modern metallurgical analysis revealed the answer. The pillar was forged from iron containing high phosphorus content. As it slowly oxidized over centuries, a thin layer of crystalline iron hydrogen phosphate hydrate formed at the metal oxide interface. This layer is incredibly stable and non-porous. It functions like a ceramic coating. Moisture cannot penetrate it. The pillar stopped rusting after forming this protective skin. Medieval European smiths were creating the same effect on a smaller scale. Every time they forged a tool from phosphorus-rich bog iron. Modern steel? We mine deep underground for pure iron ore. Then we deliberately remove phosphorus in the refining process. We traded rust resistance for easier manufacturing. But the phosphorus advantage was not unique to European bogs. Across the medieval world, certain regions became legendary for their iron, not because of superior skill alone, but because the earth itself was different there. In Toledo, Spain, medieval smiths produced blades so renowned that knights travelled across Europe to acquire them. The secret was in the ore. The iron deposits around Toledo naturally contain traces of nickel and chromium. These elements, which we deliberately add to modern stainless steel, were accidents of geology. Toledo steel resisted corrosion better than iron from other regions because the mountain itself was alloyed. In southern India, smiths produced woot steel, what Europeans called Damascus steel. Modern analysis has revealed something extraordinary in these ancient blades. They contain carbon nanotubes, structures so advanced that material scientists did not discover them until the 1990s. The medieval smiths did not know they were creating nanotechnology. The slow cooling of their crucible process, combined with trace elements in the ore, accidentally assembled these molecular structures. Medieval trade routes carried blooms of high-quality iron across continents. A smith in England might pay a month's wages for a bloom of Swedish iron, known for its purity and workability. Arabian merchants transported Indian woods cakes to Damascus, where they were forged into legendary blades. The principle was universal: beneficial impurities from local geology, combined with processes that preserved rather than removed them, created materials with properties we struggle to replicate today. We are not smarter than medieval smiths. We simply chose to optimize for different goals. Section 3. The bloomery advantage. The technology that created this superior iron was brutally simple. The bloomery furnace was a chimney of clay and stone, standing only as tall as a person. Inside, layers of charcoal and iron ore were stacked together. Bellows forced air through pipes at the base. The key was temperature control, or rather, the lack of it. A bloomery operated at roughly 1,200 degrees Celsius, hot enough to chemically reduce the ore, but crucially, not hot enough to melt the iron. Iron melts at 1,538 degrees Celsius. The bloomery never reached that threshold. What happened instead was a slow, dirty process. As the charcoal burned, it produced carbon monoxide gas. This gas pulled oxygen away from the iron ore, leaving behind particles of pure metallic iron. But all the rocky impurities in the ore, the silica and other minerals, those did melt. They formed a glassy slag that dripped down through the furnace. The solid iron particles sank into this molten slag bath, clumping together at the bottom into a spongy mass called a bloom. After hours of work, the smith would crack open the furnace and pull out this incandescent blob. It looked more like volcanic rock than metal. Here is where the magic happened. As the iron particles were forming, surrounded by burning charcoal for hours, they absorbed carbon unevenly. Some areas absorbed very little, staying as soft wrought iron. Other areas absorbed more, accidentally becoming steel. And all throughout this mess were threads of that protective slag. Modern steel is cold-rolled. Bars of steel are pressed through rollers at room temperature, shaping them quickly and efficiently. Medieval smiths did not have that option. They had to work their iron hot. The bloom was reheated in the forge and hammered over and over. This hot working did something crucial. It drove out some of the slag, yes, but it also compressed and aligned the slag that remained, stretching it into those microscopic fibre networks. Every hammer blow welded the iron particles together more tightly. Every reheating allowed carbon to redistribute. The constant working eliminated internal stresses and micro cracks. The smith was not just shaping the metal, he was fundamentally improving its internal structure with every strike. This took time. A single axe head might require 3 days of repeated heating and hammering. A modern factory stamps out the same shape in 3 minutes. We chose speed. They achieved permanence. Section 3.5. The economics of permanence. To understand why medieval iron resisted rust so well, we must understand what that iron represented. It was not simply a material. It was concentrated time, skill, and value. Those 3 days to forge a single axe head. That was 3 days of a master craftsman's labour. In medieval England, a quality axe might cost the equivalent of a labourer's wages for an entire month. A sword could represent 6 months of income. These were not purchases. They were investments meant to last a lifetime and then be passed down. This created an economic reality we have completely lost. When your grandfather's hammer cost as much as a month's food for your family, you did not throw it away because of surface rust. You maintained it, you oiled it, you stored it properly. Tools that expensive were listed in wills, fought over in inheritance disputes, and marked with the owner's symbol. Medieval blacksmiths trained for 7 years as apprentices before they could call themselves journeymen. Another 7 years might pass before a smith earned the title of master and permission to open their own forge. This was not romantic tradition, it was economic necessity. A poorly made tool that failed could kill someone. A plough that broke during planting season could mean starvation. The medieval guild system enforced this quality through brutal simplicity. If your work failed, you were expelled from the guild. No guild membership meant no legal right to sell your work. The guild's reputation was worth more than any individual smith, so quality was not optional. We look at medieval iron's rust resistance and think it was about superior technique. But technique alone means nothing without economic pressure to maintain standards. They made iron that lasted because making iron that failed was financial suicide. Today, a hardware store axe costs $15. If it rusts out in 2 years, you buy another one. The manufacturer is not punished. There is no guild to expel them. The economic incentive has inverted completely. Planned obsolescence is not a conspiracy. It is simply more profitable than permanence. Section 4. The maintenance magic we forgot. Medieval smiths understood something else we have forgotten. Fresh iron needs treatment. After forging a tool to final shape, the smith would perform a process we might call seasoning, though they did not use that word. The finished piece would be heated until it glowed dull red, then rubbed with linseed oil or animal fat, while still hot. The heat caused the oil to polymerize, forming a hard, thin coating bonded to the metal surface. This coating was not paint. It was a molecular layer that sealed the iron from moisture and oxygen. You season a cast iron pan the same way today. But modern steel tools, they come with nothing. Maybe a thin coat of machine oil that washes off the first time it rains. No one teaches you to season your tools because modern steel is disposable by design. Medieval iron that was used regularly developed another advantage. A dark, stable patina would form on the surface. This was not rust in the destructive sense. It was magnetite, a form of iron oxide that is dense and protective. Frequent use kept this patina intact. The oil from human hands, the friction of work, the regular exposure to air without prolonged moisture, all of this maintained a protective surface layer. Tools that were stored dry and used often could last for generations. The grandson would inherit his grandfather's hammer. the iron still sound. We abandoned these practices not because they did not work, but because they required care. Modern tools are designed to be replaced, not maintained. You might ask, if medieval iron was so superior in rust resistance, why do we not make it that way now? The answer is economics, not ignorance. A bloomery furnace produces perhaps 50 pounds of iron per day. A modern blast furnace produces thousands of tons. The difference is not just scale, it is control. In a blast furnace, temperatures exceed 1,500 degrees Celsius. Iron melts completely. Slag is skimmed off as liquid waste. The result is molten pig iron with high carbon content that must be refined into steel in a separate process. Fast, efficient, and consistent. But that consistency comes at a cost. You cannot control the microscopic distribution of slag stringers in liquid metal. You cannot accidentally preserve beneficial phosphorus while removing harmful sulfur. The bloomery process was slow precisely because it operated at the edge of iron's transformation, in that narrow temperature range where solid-state chemistry could work its magic. We traded that magic for the ability to make 1 billion fence posts per year. Most will rust away in a decade, but they are cheap. Section 5. The composite blade secret. The bloomery gave medieval smiths a chaotic mix of materials in every bloom: soft-wrought iron, harder steel, protective slug. A lesser craftsman might see this as a problem. A master saw it as an opportunity. The smith could read the metal. By striking a piece against a grinding wheel and watching the sparks, he could identify carbon content. Soft iron throws long, lazy orange sparks. High carbon steel erupts in brilliant white bursts. Using this sensory knowledge, the smith would sort the bloom. High carbon pieces were precious. They would form the cutting edge. The softer wrought iron, tough and shock absorbent, would form the body and spine of a blade. These pieces were forge welded together, heated to white-hot temperature. Their surfaces would begin to liquefy. A few hammer blows, and they fused permanently into one. The result was a blade with a hard edge that held sharpness, supported by a flexible core that absorbed impacts without shattering. This composite structure, hard edge and tough body, was not a single material trying to be two things. It was two materials, each doing what it did best. Some smiths took this further, creating pattern-welded blades where bars of iron and steel were twisted together before forging. The result showed a water-like pattern on the surface, beautiful and functional. But here is what matters for rust resistance. Those forge welds created more interfaces, more boundaries where slag stringers could form protective networks. A pattern-welded blade was not just strong, it was armored against corrosion from the inside out. Section 6. The science behind the sorcery. Medieval alchemy that actually worked. If you read medieval blacksmithing texts, you will find recipes that sound like witchcraft. Theophilus, a 12th century German monk, wrote in 1125 that tools are given a harder tempering in the urine of a small red-headed boy than in ordinary water. Other medieval manuscripts prescribed even stranger concoctions. One recipe called for 1 part white radish, 1 part horseradish, 1 part earthworm larvae, and 1 part buck's blood when the buck is in rut. Another recommended clarified honey, fresh urine of a he-goat, alum, borax, olive oil and salt mixed together as the perfect quenching liquid. For centuries, historians dismissed these as superstition, folklore, the mystical thinking of people who did not understand chemistry. Then modern metallurgists decided to test them. The results were surprising. Most of the exotic quenchants did not work. Blood, despite its legendary status in sword-making lore, cooled steel far too slowly to harden it properly. Milk was equally useless. The romantic image of a blade quenched in the blood of enemies, pure fantasy. But two liquids worked remarkably well: water and urine. Why urine? The answer is prosaic chemistry hiding behind mystical language. Urine contains urea, which breaks down into ammonia and carbon dioxide. But more importantly, it contains salt, sodium chloride, potassium and other mineral salts. When you plunge red-hot steel into pure water, something problematic happens. A layer of steam forms instantly around the metal. This steam envelope acts as insulation, slowing the cooling rate. If the steel cools too slowly, it will not harden properly. Salt solves this problem. The particulates in salted water or in urine, disrupt the steam layer before it can fully form. The liquid maintains direct contact with the hot metal. Cooling happens faster. Hardening succeeds. Medieval smiths discovered this through trial and error. They did not know about steam envelopes or nucleate boiling. They just knew that quenching in urine or in brine produced harder tools than pure water. So they wrapped that practical knowledge in mystical language. The urine of a red-headed boy was probably just memorable phrasing for add salt to your quench. The elaborate recipes with honey, herbs and animal parts, those added organic compounds and minerals that further disrupted steam formation. The smiths were conducting material science experiments, one quench at a time, recording what worked without understanding why. After hardening steel in a quench, medieval smiths performed another critical step, tempering. They would gently reheat the blade and watch colours spread across the polished surface. Pale straw yellow, deep bronze, peacock blue, purple. These colours were not decoration. They were an exquisitely precise temperature gauge, caused by the thickness of oxide layers forming on the steel surface. Each colour corresponded to a specific temperature, and each temperature produced different material properties. Straw yellow, around 230 degrees Celsius, made steel perfect for cutting edges. Bronze, around 255 degrees, was ideal for springs and swords that needed flexibility. Blue, around 300 degrees, created tools that could absorb impacts without shattering. The smith would heat the blade until the desired colour appeared, then immediately quench it again to lock in that exact microstructure. He was manipulating crystalline transformations in steel using nothing but his eyes and experience. We still use colour tempering today, but medieval smiths developed this technique not through understanding, but through patient observation. They noticed that a blade heated to bronze colour survived battle better than one heated to blue colour, so they codified that knowledge in guild secrets and master-apprentice relationships. The mystical language protected valuable trade secrets. But behind every invocation of the four elements or the proper phase of the moon was real, tested, repeatable science. We just needed 3 more centuries of chemistry to understand what they already knew how to do. The heart of the failure was the secret. Medieval iron was not perfect. It was not pure. It was not consistent. By every modern metallurgical standard, it was inferior material. And yet, a knife forged in the year 1300.
An animal caught in a trap will gnaw off its own leg to escape. What will you do?
In an age before modern tools or power grids, survival wasn't about gear. It was about ingenuity. Medieval people didn't wait for rescue. They built what they needed with their own hands, using materials found in the wild and knowledge passed through generations. From fire-starting tools to hunting traps, these inventions weren't just clever, they were essential. And here's the twist. Most of them still work today. Whether you're a bushcraft enthusiast or just curious, these 7 tools prove that old world wisdom never went out of style. Shepherd's sling and slingshot traps. Centuries before rifles and revolvers, survival often came down to rope, leather, and a stone. The shepherd's sling was one of the oldest ranged weapons known to man. Simple, silent, and deadly in skilled hands, it wasn't a knight's weapon. It belonged to herders, travelers, and peasants living far from walls and watchtowers. With nothing more than braided cord and a leather pouch, they could turn smooth stones into airborne projectiles, capable of stunning birds, knocking out hares, or warding off predators. It was a tool of necessity, and it worked. Training with a sling was part of growing up in many rural regions. Boys practiced by hitting tree trunks, fence posts, or even moving targets like fruit thrown in the air. With time, their accuracy became impressive, sometimes lethal. The physics behind it were as elegant as they were effective. By spinning the sling, the thrower built up centrifugal force, then released one end at the perfect moment, sending the stone flying at speeds that could rival early crossbows. But the sling wasn't the only clever hunting tool in the medieval wild. Slingshot traps, known by various local names, were a favorite among peasants and forest dwellers. These primitive devices relied on tension and timing. A sapling was bent and held under strain, often with a snare or trigger mechanism made from string or vine. When an animal stepped into the wrong spot or disturbed the bait, the trap would snap upward, tightening the noose and lifting the prey from the ground. It was quiet, efficient, and reusable. These traps didn't require iron or craftsmanship. They just needed a sharp knife, patience, and a solid understanding of animal behavior. Hunters placed them near burrows, watering holes, or well-used trails. Sometimes they set dozens at once, checking them at dawn to collect whatever the forest had offered. And when paired with other passive traps like deadfalls or pitfall pits, they became part of a low-tech but high-yield hunting system. What made both the sling and slingshot traps so valuable was their adaptability. Unlike heavy bows or metal traps, they were lightweight, easy to conceal, and fast to repair. If a sling wore out, you braided a new one. If a trap was triggered without a catch, you reset it in minutes. No blacksmith, no forge, just skill and local materials. Even today, these tools are seeing a quiet resurgence among bushcrafters, off-grid homesteaders, and survival instructors. Why? Because they teach something that's easy to forget in an age of gadgets and gear. Survival isn't about having the best tool. It's about knowing how to make the most with what you have. And in that sense, the medieval sling and trap are still doing what they've always done, feeding those who take the time to learn them. Tinderbox and flint striker kits. Fire wasn't just something you made, it was something you carried. For medieval travelers, soldiers, and even villagers heading into the woods, the tinderbox was as essential as a blade or cloak. It was survival in your pocket, a way to start fire when the weather turned, when night fell, when everything was wet and there was no second chance. At its core, the tinderbox was simple, just a small metal or wooden container holding everything needed to spark flame. Inside, a piece of flint, a striker made of carbon steel, and most importantly, tinder. Not just any tinder, but cloth that had been charred in fire, usually linen or cotton, blackened but not burned, ready to catch the smallest ember and turn it into heat. Here's how it worked. You held the flint in one hand, the striker in the other, and struck them together at a sharp angle. Sparks flew, tiny, fleeting, but hot. When one landed on the char cloth, it smoldered, not a flame, but a glowing coal. That coal was then transferred to a nest of dry grass, bark shavings, or animal fur. A few steady breaths, a curl of smoke, then flame. It was slow, deliberate, and deeply satisfying. And it was repeatable, even in cold or damp conditions, if your materials were dry and your hands steady. Every medieval household had some version of this kit. Soldiers carried them in satchels. Travelers tied them to belts. Some were wrapped in leather, others packed in carved boxes, sealed against rain. It was one of the few tools that crossed every social class, from peasant huts to noble camps, because no one could afford to be without fire. More than just heat, fire was light. It was protection. It was a way to boil water, cook meat, sterilize wounds, dry clothing, and keep animals, or worse, at bay. In times of famine or war, knowing how to use a tinderbox meant you didn't have to rely on anyone else. And that kind of knowledge was power. Today, these kits are often recreated by survivalists and reenactors. Modern versions may include ferro rods or magnesium blocks, but the principle is unchanged. Spark plus tinder equals life. And in that glowing coal caught on blackened cloth, you're not just lighting a fire, you're holding history. Medieval bow drill, fire starter. Fire was everything. In the medieval world, it meant warmth, safety, cooked food, and sterilized water. But when the skies were wet and the wind howled through the trees, starting one without flint or matches was a different story. That's where the bow drill came in, an ancient, elegant solution to a fundamental problem: how to make fire from friction. The bow drill wasn't invented in the Middle Ages, but it was perfected by those who depended on it. Simple in design, profound in use, it consisted of 5 parts: the spindle, the hearth board, the bearing block, a bit of tinder, and of course, the bow. None of it required metal, just dry wood, cordage, and hands that knew what they were doing. Here's how it worked. The spindle, a straight, finger-length stick, was pressed vertically onto the hearth board, a flat piece of softer wood with a carved notch. The bow, strung tightly with cord, was wrapped around the spindle. One hand gripped the bow, the other pressed down on the spindle using a stone or bone-bearing block. Then came the rhythm, back and forth, back and forth. The bow turned the spindle. The spindle rubbed against the hearth. Smoke curled, dust turned black. And if everything was done just right, if the speed was steady and the pressure firm, that blackened dust would catch, forming a tiny glowing ember, a flicker of heat, born from nothing more than wood and determination. But creating fire this way wasn't just about mechanics. It was about knowing your materials. Different woods created different results. Too hard, and they wouldn't generate enough friction. Too soft, and they'd crumble. Willow and elder were popular choices for the hearth. Hazel or spindlewood often served for the drill. Cordage came from animal sinew, twisted plant fibers, or even rawhide. Every part mattered. In medieval villages and outposts, the bow drill was often a last resort. Flint and steel were prized, but not always available, especially to the poor. So the bow drill was passed down like a family heirloom, not the tool itself, but the knowledge. Children learned it beside the fire they helped start. Travelers carried pieces of dry hearthboard wrapped in cloth, knowing that if the rains came, the right wood might be hard to find. Today, the bow drill is often treated like a novelty in survival courses. But in truth, it's one of the purest expressions of bushcraft, creating fire without chemicals, sparks, or shortcuts. It demands patience, awareness, and respect for the materials, and in return, it offers the one thing every survivalist needs most. Because once you have fire, everything else changes. A cold night becomes bearable, a raw meal becomes nourishing, and the fear that once crept in with the dark, it vanishes in the light of something you made with your own two hands. Folding wooden tripod, cooking plus smoking rack. Before cast iron stoves or steel grills, medieval people had to rely on tools that could be built, broken down, and rebuilt again, over fire, in the forest, or on the move. One of the simplest and most reliable among them was the folding wooden tripod. At first glance, it doesn't look like much, just 3 poles, some notches, and a length of cord. But with that, you get a versatile frame that could cook your food, boil your water, smoke your meat, and even dry your clothes, right in the heart of the wild. Building one was straightforward. 3 straight, sturdy branches, typically about shoulder height, were cut and trimmed. Each was notched or sharpened at one end and tied together at the top using strong cordage, vines, or strips of rawhide. When spread out, the tripod stood firmly over a fire, and from its center, you could suspend anything. A clay pot, a metal kettle, a piece of meat, or even a woven basket of herbs or fish. But the tripod's magic wasn't just in cooking. It doubled as a smoking rack, an essential tool in a world without refrigeration. Once game was caught and cleaned, strips of meat were hung from crossbars laid over the tripod's shoulders. A low, smoldering fire below, usually fueled by damp wood, herbs, or moss, would send up smoke that dried and preserved the meat over hours or days. It was one of the few ways to keep food edible through winter, war, or travel. In coastal or forested regions, people added horizontal slats and wove racks between the legs, creating makeshift smokers or drying shelves. Fish, mushrooms, roots, everything that could spoil was given a second life with smoke and airflow. The tripod could be set up in minutes, taken down in seconds, and used again wherever it was needed. It didn't rust, it didn't warp, and if it broke, you made another. This simplicity was key in a medieval world where time and materials were always limited. You didn't need nails, metal, or tools beyond a hatchet and a bit of skill. You didn't need to be strong, just clever. And because it folded, it could travel with you, whether you were moving camp, following a herd, or just finding better shelter after a storm. Modern bushcrafters still use the wooden tripod for all the same reasons. It's efficient, sustainable, and endlessly adaptable. Add a hanging chain and you've got a modern twist. Swap out the wood for bamboo or birch and you can adapt to different environments. Want to go ultra primitive? Use twisted plant fiber or bark as rope. But the essence remains the same. Fire below, survival above. In every era, the tripod reminds us that the best tools aren't always bought. They're built. From scavenged limbs and scorched rope Medieval people created a kitchen, a smokehouse, and a survival system that still works today. Because when your shelter is the wild and your pantry is whatever you've caught, every stick counts. Clay pot refrigerator. Before ice boxes, before electricity, before cold storage was even a concept, there was ingenuity. Medieval people knew that preserving food wasn't about technology. It was about temperature, airflow, and time-tested tricks passed from one hungry winter to the next. That's how they built early refrigerators from clay and turned simple holes in the ground into life-saving pantries. The clay pot refrigerator, sometimes called a zier pot today, relied on one basic principle: evaporative cooling. 2 clay pots, one inch to the other, with the space between filled with damp sand. As water evaporated through the porous outer pot, it pulled heat away from the inner chamber, dropping the temperature inside. Place this in the shade, keep it wet, and you had a surprisingly cool container, enough to preserve milk, vegetables, even leftover stew for days longer than open air would allow. It sounds like magic, but it's simple physics. In medieval towns, these clay coolers were used in markets and homes alike. Farmers kept cheese or butter cool on warm days. Herbalists stored poultices and infusions. Fishmongers kept their catch fresh until it could be salted or cooked. You didn't need a river or snow, you just needed clay, water, and the wisdom to use both right. But when winter came, or when you needed to store things for the long haul, the strategy shifted underground. Root cellars and storage pits were as old as agriculture itself. Peasants dug them near the house or barn, lining the walls with straw, stone, or wood. These pits took advantage of the Earth's stable temperature, keeping food cool in summer and above freezing in winter. It was a natural refrigerator, powered by the planet itself. Inside, they stored root vegetables like turnips, parsnips, and carrots. Cabbage heads were wrapped in cloth. Apples were laid in layers of straw. Even smoked meats or grains were stored here, protected from rodents by sealed lids or lifted shelves. The key was moisture control. Too dry and food shriveled. Too damp and it rotted. So villagers learned to balance airflow and insulation. Venting pits, layering materials, even placing charcoal to absorb odors. Some communities dug these pits beneath homes, keeping food literally beneath their feet. Others shared larger communal storage pits, checked daily during lean months. In either case, the message was clear: waste nothing, store everything, because you never knew when the next crop might fail. Today, as modern society faces rising energy costs and unstable systems, these ancient techniques are coming back. Off-grid homesteaders build clay pot fridges to preserve fresh food in desert climates. Survivalists dig root pits in forest shelters. And those looking to live closer to the land are finding that refrigeration doesn't have to plug into a wall. It just has to work. And in the quiet dark of a well-dug pit, or the damp walls of a hand-shaped pot, medieval wisdom whispers again: the earth will keep your food if you know how to ask it. Bushcraft shelter pegs and binding techniques. Shelter wasn't a structure, it was a skill. In the medieval world, you couldn't always count on walls. Whether herding livestock, traveling between villages, or escaping war-torn regions, people needed to build with whatever the forest gave them. And with just a hatchet, rope, and a good eye for timber, they could. The secret? Pegs and bindings. Forget nails or metal fasteners. Most peasants couldn't afford them. Instead, they used sharpened wooden pegs, split branches, and twisted fibers to create strong, stable structures that could withstand rain, wind, and snow. It wasn't just bushcraft, it was architecture adapted to survival. It started with the frame. 3 or 4 thick limbs were cut from hardwood trees, oak, ash, or hazel, and driven into the ground. These formed the main posts. Crossbeams were lashed between them, secured with bindings made from twisted bark strips, nettle cordage, or even animal sinew. The joints were reinforced with wooden pegs, tapered by hand and hammered through pre-carved holes. This gave stability without relying on nails or glue. Then came the roof. Branches were woven between beams to form a lattice. Over that, layers of bark, leaves, or thatch were added for insulation and waterproofing. In colder seasons, mud or moss was packed into the gaps. A good builder knew how to angle the roof for runoff, how to raise the floor with logs, and how to vent smoke from a small internal fire. None of this required a single piece of iron. It was a system based entirely on knowledge, on how to split wood without cracking it, how to strip fibers for rope, how to find trees that bent instead of snapped. It was taught by example, passed down from parent to child, not written down, but remembered in hands and muscle memory. Some medieval hunting lodges and field shelters stood for seasons without repair. Others were dismantled and rebuilt as people moved with the seasons or game. The technique was flexible, scalable, and surprisingly strong, especially when time and weather didn't allow for more permanent structures. Today, bushcraft experts use the same methods to build off-grid shelters, emergency camps, or even full cabins. And whether it's a lean-to, an A-frame, or a thatched lodge, the principles are the same. Use the land, respect the material, and let knowledge do the work. Because in the wild, survival isn't about owning tools. It's about knowing how to make them count. Water purifier with charcoal and sand layers. In medieval life, water could be a blessing or a death sentence. Rivers brought life to crops and cattle, but they also carried waste, rot, and disease. Wells were safer, but not always accessible. And in times of war, famine, or drought, even clean water could vanish overnight. So how did people survive? With something deceptively simple: layered filtration using charcoal, sand, and cloth. This wasn't modern science. It was observation, trial and error, passed down wisdom that said, if you run water through the earth long enough, it comes out cleaner. And from that, peasants and monks alike learned to build rudimentary purifiers using the most basic materials: barrels, clay jars, woven baskets, and what nature gave them. The design was often vertical. A container, usually a wooden barrel or a large ceramic pot, was filled in layers. At the bottom, gravel or coarse stones to catch large debris. Then, a layer of fine sand packed tightly to remove cloudiness and trap smaller particles. On top of that, crushed charcoal, burned wood from cooking fires, ground to a coarse black powder. Charcoal was the secret weapon. It didn't just absorb color and odor, it captured bacteria, filtered out some toxins, and improved taste, especially in stagnant water pulled from puddles or cisterns. Above the charcoal, people often placed cloth or moss as a pre-filter, removing insects, leaves, or larger waste. The result? Water that was visibly cleaner, safer to drink, and less likely to cause illness in an age where disease could wipe out entire villages. It wasn't perfect. It didn't kill everything, but it reduced risk. And in a world where one bad drink could mean fever, dysentery, or death, that was everything. These filters were often placed near hearths or gardens, close to where water was drawn daily. They weren't built for pressure or speed, but for patience. Slow drip filters, some of which took hours to produce a single jug of water. But that slowness was the point. The longer the water spent in contact with charcoal and sand, the cleaner it became. Some versions went further. Monasteries and larger estates sometimes built permanent stone filtration systems, channeling rainwater through troughs lined with layers of sand and ash. In colder climates, snowmelt was filtered this way too, captured in basins, melted by sun or fire, and dripped through multi-layered jars before use. Today, these same principles are used in emergency filters, off-grid systems, and eco-villages around the world.
The word blacksmith is a clue that nobody followed. The black does not refer to soot or charcoal or the color of the forge. It refers to something that modern industry now charges a premium to replicate in chemical baths. Medieval smiths created it every time they lit a fire, but that was only the beginning. On top of that first layer, they applied two more, using ingredients that cost them nothing and a process that took under 10 minutes. We are still finding tools treated this way in museum collections, 600 and 700 years later, with surfaces intact. The modern coatings industry does not want you to know how simple this is, because if you understood what a medieval blacksmith did with materials from his own village, you would have a hard time justifying what we spend today on products that still crack, chip and peel. Have you ever tried to protect iron from rust using old methods? If you have, tell me how it held up. Drop a comment. I am genuinely curious, because the science behind what medieval smiths actually did is far more sophisticated than anyone gives them credit for. what medieval smiths created by accident. To understand why this medieval treatment works, you need to understand what happens to iron when it is heated. When a blacksmith places iron into the forge and brings it up to working temperature, somewhere between 700 and 1100 degrees Celsius, the surface of the metal reacts with oxygen in the air. This is not rust. Rust is iron 3 oxide, the red crumbling corrosion that destroys metal over time. What forms at forge temperature is something fundamentally different. At these extreme temperatures, the iron surface converts into a compound called magnetite. Its chemical formula is Fe3O4. Unlike rust, which is porous and flaky and allows moisture to continue attacking the metal underneath, magnetite is dense and tightly bonded to the iron surface. It forms a physical barrier between the metal and the atmosphere. This is why freshly forged iron comes out of the fire with that distinctive blue-black surface. That surface is not a coating applied to the metal. It is the metal itself, transformed into a different chemical state. The outer atoms of the iron have been converted into a protective shell. Here is what makes this remarkable. Modern industry has an entire sector dedicated to replicating this exact process. It is called black oxide finishing. Companies heat iron and steel parts in chemical baths containing sodium hydroxide, nitrates, and nitrites at around 141 degrees Celsius. The chemicals force the surface to convert into magnetite, the same magnetite that a medieval blacksmith created every time he pulled a piece from the forge. The modern process was patented in the early 20th century. Companies charge anywhere from $2 to $8 per piece for small hardware, and much more for larger components. What they are selling is a controlled version of what blacksmiths had been doing for free since the Iron Age. But there is an important limitation. Magnetite alone is not waterproof. It slows corrosion significantly, but moisture can still penetrate through micro cracks and pores in the oxide layer. Medieval smiths understood this through centuries of trial and error. They knew the black surface needed something more, and the solution they found was growing in the fields around them. How plant oil becomes plastic. Flax is one of the oldest cultivated plants in human history. Archaeological evidence of its use dates back over 9,000 years to sites in Syria and Turkey. The Romans grew it extensively. Pliny the Elder documented flaxseed in the rations of Roman soldiers. And in the 8th century, Emperor Charlemagne issued a decree requiring the people of France to grow and consume flaxseed for their health. But for blacksmiths, the real value of flax was not in the fibre or the food. It was in the oil pressed from the seeds, linseed oil. What makes linseed oil different from almost every other plant oil is its extraordinary concentration of a fatty acid called alpha-linolenic acid. Linseed oil contains between 57 and 71% polyunsaturated fats. This chemical composition gives it a property that medieval smiths exploited but never fully understood. When exposed to air, linseed oil does not simply dry. It undergoes a chemical transformation called polymerization. Here is the science. The polyunsaturated fatty acid chains in linseed oil contain multiple double bonds between carbon atoms. When these bonds are exposed to oxygen, they break open and form cross-links with neighboring chains. This is called autoxidation. The individual oil molecules stop being independent and begin connecting into a vast three-dimensional network. The liquid oil literally transforms into a solid polymer. This is not a metaphor. Linseed oil becomes plastic, not the kind that comes from petroleum, a natural, durable, cross-linked polymer that bonds directly to whatever surface it was applied on. And when that surface is hot iron, the bond is permanent. Medieval blacksmiths discovered that wiping linseed oil onto iron while it was still warm from the forge, not forge hot, but warm enough that the oil smoked slightly, around 200 degrees Celsius, produced a hard, dark finish that resisted moisture and corrosion far better than oil alone. What they did not know, and what modern chemistry has confirmed, is that the heat dramatically accelerates the polymerization process. At room temperature, raw linseed oil takes weeks or even months to fully cure. At 200 degrees Celsius, the cross-linking begins almost immediately. The result is a thin, hard film that fills every microscopic pore and irregularity in the magnetite layer beneath it. In the medieval era, smiths went even further. They boiled linseed oil with lead oxide, a substance called litharge, to create what was known as boiled linseed oil. The lead oxide formed metallic soaps that catalyzed the polymerization reaction, making the oil cure faster and harder. This technique is documented as far back as the medieval period in Europe. Modern science has confirmed the effectiveness. Research on self-healing coatings, published in Progress in Organic Coatings, demonstrated that linseed oil microcapsules embedded in epoxy resin provided superior corrosion protection for carbon steel. The linseed oil released upon damage to the coating surface polymerized on contact with air, sealing the breach. The researchers were, in effect, trying to automate what a medieval blacksmith did by hand with a rag. If that changed how you think about rust protection, a quick like helps this reach more people who value this kind of forgotten knowledge. There was, however, one weakness in the oil finish. While polymerized linseed oil is hard and durable, it is not completely impervious to moisture over extended periods, particularly in outdoor conditions. Medieval smiths had an answer for that too. And like everything else in this system, it was free. The wax seal, nature's waterproof barrier. The final layer in the medieval iron treatment was beeswax. Medieval Europe ran on beeswax. Every monastery kept hives. Every church burned beeswax candles. Chandlers, candle makers, were among the most important tradesmen in any medieval town. Beeswax was so valuable that it was sometimes used to pay taxes and tithes. But for blacksmiths, beeswax was a finishing material. The application method was direct. After the linseed oil layer had begun to cure on the warm iron, the smith would rub a block of solid beeswax across the still warm surface. The heat melted the wax on contact, allowing it to flow into every micropore and surface imperfection that the oil had not completely filled. As the metal cooled, the wax solidified into a thin, even coating. Beeswax is naturally hydrophobic. Water beads on its surface and rolls off. It creates a physical moisture barrier that sits on top of the polymerized oil layer and prevents water from ever reaching the magnetite or the iron beneath. Unlike petroleum-based waxes, beeswax remains slightly flexible as it ages. It does not crack and separate from the surface the way many modern coatings do. Blacksmiths working today still use this technique. A common traditional recipe calls for a mixture of 2 parts: beeswax to 1 part linseed oil, melted together and applied to iron, heated to around 215 degrees Celsius. The wax and oil blend fills pores and creates a unified protective film. Some smiths add turpentine as a solvent to thin the mixture for easier application, though this is not strictly necessary. The result is a finish that deepens the black color of the forge scale, produces a subtle satin sheen, and creates a surface that repels moisture with remarkable effectiveness. One machinist writing on an industrial forum described applying beeswax dissolved in turpentine to cast iron equipment in his shop 20 years ago. In a shop without air conditioning, where condensation regularly formed on metal surfaces, the wax-treated iron showed no rust after 2 decades. The armor that was never shining. There is a reason this system spread far beyond the forge. Hollywood has taught us that medieval armor was mirror-bright polished steel, knights in shining armor. The reality was almost the opposite. The majority of medieval plate armor was painted, and the paint they used was linseed oil mixed with pigment, most commonly iron oxide, the same hematite that forms naturally in the earth. Modern Swedish companies still sell this exact formula as a premium rust protection primer. Under a microscope, the hematite particles arrange themselves in overlapping layers, like fish scales, creating a physical barrier that makes it extremely difficult for moisture to reach the metal underneath. Iron oxide in linseed oil is not just paint. It is a corrosion-resistant composite, the same principle the blacksmith's 3-layer system was built on. Only the knightly class invested in polishing their plate armor to a mirror finish. Johannes Roth, writing in the Ritterspiegel in 1415, explained that a well-polished armor represented a knight's virtue and courage. Squires were specifically trained to clean, polish and oil their master's armor after each use. But that kind of maintenance was a luxury. For common soldiers and mercenaries, paint was cheaper and more practical. The English White Company of the 14th century, one of the most feared mercenary bands in Europe, was considered remarkable precisely because they kept their armor bright and unpainted. It was so unusual that it became their defining characteristic and their name. Everyone else painted their armor. That was the default. Even weapons were protected this way. Steel crossbow prods in the Wallace collection in London, including the Fels Colonna bow, survive with remnants of painted parchment glued over the steel, part decoration, part rust protection. The same linseed oil, the same iron oxide, the same principle. The linseed oil system was not a curiosity of the forge. It was the standard corrosion technology of an entire civilization. From nails to plowshares to the armor that held together medieval armies, linseed oil and iron oxide did the work that we now spend billions trying to replicate with synthetic chemistry. 3 layers working together. Now step back and look at what the medieval blacksmith actually created. Layer 1. Magnetite. The forge heat converts the outer surface of the iron into a dense, stable oxide that acts as a chemical barrier between the metal and the environment. This layer is not applied. It is grown from the iron itself. It is bonded at the atomic level. Layer 2. Polymerized linseed oil. The oil penetrates into the micropores and surface irregularities of the magnetite, then cross-links into a permanent polymer network. This fills the weaknesses in the oxide layer and creates a secondary barrier that is both hard and chemically resistant. Layer 3. Beeswax. The wax seals the entire surface, creating a hydrophobic outer layer that prevents moisture from reaching either of the layers beneath. It is flexible enough to withstand thermal expansion and minor impacts without cracking. 3 layers, each one addressing a specific vulnerability. The magnetite stops chemical attack. The polymer fills structural weakness. The wax stops moisture delivery. Together, they form a composite coating system that would be immediately recognizable to any modern corrosion engineer. If you doubt ancient smiths understood this, consider the Iron Pillar of Delhi. This 7-meter iron structure was forged around 400 CE. It has stood outdoors in India for over 1600 years and has barely rusted. Researchers at the Indian Institute of Technology, Kanpur, found that its corrosion resistance comes from a thin passive film built on magnetite, the same F304 that medieval European smiths created every time they heated iron. The principle is the same, a stable oxide layer bonded to the metal, sealed by a secondary compound that blocks moisture. Ancient smiths on 2 continents, separated by centuries, arrived at the same solution. Now compare this to what the modern coatings industry offers. POR 15 rust preventive coating costs $45 for a single pint. The full 3-step system, including their cleaner degreaser and metal prep solution, runs well over $80. It requires careful surface preparation, multiple thin coats, proper humidity control below 75%, and a UV-resistant top coat for any outdoor exposure. If it chips, the exposed metal rusts. Cerakote, the ceramic coating popular for firearms and industrial parts, starts at $65 for a single small component. A complete firearm costs $275 or more. It requires specialized equipment, an oven for heat curing, and professional application. Powder coating a steel bumper runs around $250, and as anyone who has used powder-coated parts on rough terrain knows, the moment the coating chips, corrosion begins underneath and spreads invisibly until the entire coating flakes off. The medieval blacksmith system required a forge he already had, linseed oil pressed from flax growing in the field, and beeswax from hives that every village kept. Total cost, nothing. Application time, under 10 minutes. And when the finish was damaged, he could repair it with a torch and a rag in 60 seconds. How to do this today? Here is the complete process for applying the medieval iron treatment. You will need 3 things. Boiled linseed oil, which you can buy at any hardware store for around $8 a quart. A block of pure beeswax, available from beekeepers or craft suppliers for around $5. And a heat source, a forge, a torch, or even a kitchen oven. Step 1. Prepare the metal. Remove any existing rust, paint or contamination. A wire brush works. Sandpaper works. The surface needs to be clean, bare metal. Step 2. Heat the metal. Bring it up to around 200 to 215 degrees Celsius. If you do not have a temperature gauge, use the linseed oil itself as an indicator. When the oil begins to smoke lightly upon contact with the metal, the temperature is right. If it scorches instantly, the metal is too hot. Let it cool slightly. Step 3. Apply the linseed oil. Using a cotton rag, it must be 100% cotton, as synthetic fibers will melt at these temperatures. Wipe a thin coat of boiled linseed oil onto the heated surface. The oil will darken and begin to polymerize almost immediately. Wipe off excess. Thin coats are critical. Thick applications will bubble and produce an uneven finish. Step 4. Apply the beeswax. While the metal is still warm but no longer smoking, rub a block of beeswax directly across the surface. The wax will melt on contact and spread into a thin, even film. Buff lightly with a clean cotton rag. If you prefer, you can pre-mix the wax and oil. Melt 2 parts beeswax into 1 part linseed oil. Stir until blended and apply the warm mixture with a rag. Step 5. Let it cure. The finish will continue to harden over the next 24 to 48 hours as the linseed oil completes its polymerization. One critical safety warning: rags soaked in linseed oil can spontaneously combust. This is not an exaggeration. In 1991, a fire in the One Meridian Plaza building in Philadelphia killed 3 firefighters. The cause was traced to rags soaked in linseed oil. When polyunsaturated fats oxidize, they generate heat. A bunched-up rag provides insulation that traps the heat, and the temperature can rise until the rag ignites. After use, spread your rags flat on a non-combustible surface to dry, or submerge them in water in a sealed metal container. Never ball them up and throw them in a bin. For maintenance, reapply a thin coat of the wax and oil blend once a year for outdoor items. For indoor tools and hardware, the treatment can last years without renewal. Open your garage or your tool shed right now and count: a machete for brush, pruning shears for branches, a hatchet for splitting, a folding saw for thick limbs, a swing blade for undergrowth, maybe a froe if you do any woodworking. 6 tools, possibly 7. Each one does exactly one job. Each one costs you $30 to $60. Most of them are stamped from thin steel in a factory somewhere in China, and most of them will need replacing within 5 years. A medieval peasant had one blade, and that single blade did every job on this list. It pruned vineyards, it split kindling, it built fences, it cleared forests, it shaped handles, it stripped bark, it harvested crops, it even served as a weapon of war. The same blade worked from field to forest to battlefield and back again, without modification. This tool existed for over 3,000 years. Bronze examples have been recovered from the seafloor around Greece, dating to roughly 1,500 years before Christ. Iron versions have been found in pre-Roman settlements across England, France, Germany and Switzerland. It was so effective that one French manufacturer alone held templates for more than 3,000 regional variations, 3,000 ways to solve the same problem, each one optimized for a specific landscape, a specific crop, a specific type of wood, and yet almost no one in America has ever heard of it. You are about to learn why the billhook was the most sophisticated simple tool ever designed, why it outperforms every modern equivalent, and why the story of how it disappeared tells you everything you need to know about what we have lost. Before we get into this, how many tools do you carry when you clear brush on your property? Drop a comment. I am genuinely curious. The geometry of genius. At first glance, a billhook looks crude. It is a thick blade, roughly 8 to 10 inches long, mounted on a short wooden handle. The blade starts straight near the handle, then curves increasingly toward the tip, ending in a pronounced hook. It looks like someone bent a machete, but that curve is not an accident. It is 3,000 years of engineering compressed into a single line. Here is what makes the billhook fundamentally different from every straight-bladed tool. When you swing a machete at a branch, the straight edge hits the wood and the force is distributed across the entire contact surface. If the branch is green or thick, the machete bounces. The thin blade vibrates in your hand. You have to swing harder. After an hour, your wrists hurt. After a day, your grip is shot. The machete needs speed and force to cut. That is its design limitation. The billhook does something entirely different. When that curved blade contacts a branch, the hook catches the material and pulls it into the sharpened inner edge. The wood has nowhere to go. Instead of bouncing off, the blade draws through the cut like a sickle. But unlike a sickle, the billhook has the mass of a hatchet. The weight does the work. Users who switch from machetes to billhooks consistently report the same thing. You swing slower, you grip lighter. The tool does the cutting, not your arm. And this is where it gets remarkable. The blade is sharpened only on the inside of that curve. The outside, the part that faces the ground, is blunt. This is not laziness. This is deliberate engineering. When you clear brush, you chop close to the ground. A machete at ground level hits dirt and rocks. One afternoon of ground level clearing destroys the edge. The billhook's blunt outer curve acts as a shield. It slides across the ground without damage, while the protected inner edge stays sharp. In German-speaking countries, the billhook is called a rote Axt, which translates to clearing axe. The name tells you exactly what it was designed for. Ground-level work day after day, without losing its edge. The bevel angle of the cutting edge is another piece of quiet engineering. It is ground at a relatively obtuse angle, wider than you would expect for a cutting tool. This seems counterintuitive. A sharper angle cuts easier, right? It does, but in dry wood, in green wood, which is what a peasant cut most of the year, a thin bevel binds. It gets stuck in the fibrous wet material. The bevel hook's wider bevel pushes through green wood without jamming. Medieval edge tool makers understood the difference between cutting dead material and cutting living material, and they optimized for the job that actually needed doing. But there is more. Many billhook patterns include a second blade, a short straight edge on the back of the hook, like a small hatchet built into the same tool. The front curve handles brush, vines and saplings. The back edge chops through thick branches and splits kindling. Some users kept the front edge at working sharpness for general cutting and the back edge razor sharp for delicate work, trimming stakes and doing fine shaping that would dull a rougher blade. The handle deserves attention too, almost universally made from ash wood across Europe, not because ash was common, though it was, because ash has a unique property among European hardwoods. It absorbs repeated impact without transmitting vibration to the hand. A machete with a hardwood handle rattles your bones after an hour. An ash-handled billhook feels almost silent in your grip. Medieval craftsmen did not stumble onto this. They selected this specific wood for this specific purpose. Something does not add up. A tool this carefully engineered, this effective across 3,000 years of continuous use. Why has nobody heard of it? One blade for everything. To understand what a billhook actually was, you have to understand what a medieval peasant actually did. A small landholder in 14th century England did not have a hardware store. He had a forge, sometimes shared with an entire village. Iron and steel were expensive. A worn-out billhook would not be thrown away. It would be brought back to the smith and reforged into something new. Old iron was a valuable resource, which is one reason so few medieval billhooks survive in the archaeological record. Every metal tool was an investment measured in days of labor. A peasant might own 3 or 4 bladed tools in his entire life. The billhook was often the most important one. With a billhook, a peasant could manage a hedgerow. This was not gardening. In medieval England, hedgerows were property boundaries, livestock fences, windbreaks, and fuel sources all at once. Hedge laying, the technique of partially cutting through a stem, bending it horizontal, and weaving it into a living fence, was done almost entirely with a billhook. The hedger would strike partway through the base of a young tree, careful not to sever it completely, then bend the still living stem down at an angle and weave it between upright stakes. One tool built a fence that repaired itself by continuing to grow, fed livestock with leaf cuttings, provided firewood from annual trimmings, and lasted generations without a single nail or a single post. The same billhook cleared land for planting. It coppiced hazel and willow, cutting the trunks at ground level so they would regrow as multiple straight poles. Those poles became fencing, baskets, wattle walls, tool handles, and charcoal. A coppiced woodland managed with billhooks was not a wild forest. It was a renewable factory, producing a steady supply of building materials on rotation cycles of 7 to 20 years. This one cutting technique, done with this one tool, supplied materials for construction, fuel, and trade goods. In France and Italy, the billhook was the primary tool of viticulture. Pruning grapevines requires precision. You need to cut specific growth without damaging the main vine. The curved blade allowed vignerons to hook individual shoots and sever them with a controlled pull. Miniature billhooks were used during the grape harvest itself. Illuminated manuscripts from the 10th through 16th centuries are filled with images of hooded peasants pruning vines with billhooks. A French prayer book written around 1288 in southern France shows a peasant pruning with a billhook in striking detail. February and March, the pruning months, appear in Book of Hours manuscripts so frequently with billhook illustrations that the tool became a symbol of the season itself. Cathedral carvings and stained glass windows at Notre Dame in Paris and at Autun depict the same scenes. The billhook was not merely a tool, it was an icon of peasant life, depicted as routinely as the plough. The straight section between handle and hook could serve as a knife. The hook itself could strip bark from saplings. working like a draw knife to smooth and shape wood for handles, stakes, or construction. With the back blade, a peasant could split logs small enough for a hearth. One tool, no trip to a store, no replacement parts, no batteries. And here is a detail that most people miss. The phrase by hook or crook is not just an expression, it comes from a specific medieval legal right. Peasants were permitted to gather firewood from their lord's forest using only a billhook or a shepherd's crook. They could pull down dead branches with the crook and cut them with the hook. No axe, no saw. The law was practical. It kept forests managed for the nobility while allowing peasants to collect fuel in a controlled way. The billhook was so central to rural survival that it entered the English language permanently. If that changed how you think about medieval tools, a quick like helps this reach more people. 3,000 patterns. Here is where this story becomes extraordinary. A billhook was not one tool, it was a family of thousands. In Britain alone, there were at least 11 major regional patterns, each designed for the specific vegetation, soil, and working methods of its area. The Warwickshire pattern had a 6-inch handle and 10-inch blade, with both a curved front edge and a straight back edge. It was the choice of Midlands hedgers, who needed a tool for both rough cutting and delicate trimming in a single hand. The Yorkshire pattern was a 2-handed tool with a 14-inch handle, sometimes up to 36 inches. It was heavier because Yorkshire hedges grew thicker and demanded more chopping force. In Wales, the Carmarthenshire pattern had something no other billhook had. A small notch at the top of the blade called a hedge grip. This notch allowed the hedger to push pleaches, the partially cut stems being woven into the hedge, into position without using bare hands on thorny branches. One small design feature that solved a specific problem that only existed in Welsh hedge-laying technique. The Kent pattern had a single beveled blade, available in right-handed and left-handed versions. Think about that. A medieval edge tool maker offered left-handed options for a farming implement. This was not mass production. This was precision craftsmanship responsive to individual users. But Britain was only the beginning. Cross the English Channel and the variation explodes. The French firm Talabot, based in Sault-du-Tarn, maintained templates for over 3,000 different billhook patterns in their archives. Their 1935 catalogue illustrated more than 200 regional designs, and they stated they would forge any other pattern upon receipt of a paper template or cardboard cutout from the customer. 3,000 patterns from a single company, in a single country. This is the medieval equivalent of mass customization, centuries before the term existed. Every village smithy forged billhooks to the user's specifications. The blade thickness matched local hardwood density. The curve radius matched the diameter of branches being cut. The weight matched the user's strength and working style. A billhook from Devon was heavier than one from Somerset, not because Devon smiths were less skilled, but because Devon hedges were thicker and demanded more mass behind the cut. And billhooks were not even the most varied tool in the catalogue. Talabot also held templates for 7,000 patterns of scythe and 5,000 patterns of sickle. The idea that medieval manufacturing was primitive does not survive contact with these numbers. And here is the part that matters. Many of these regional variations are now lost. The specific reasons why a Monmouth pattern had a pronounced thickened nose, or why a Welsh pattern had a dished blade, concave on one side and convex on the other, are no longer understood. 3,000 patterns, each one a solution to a problem that someone, somewhere, once understood intimately, and most of that knowledge has simply vanished. This was not primitive tool-making. This was an engineering tradition so sophisticated that it produced more specialized variations than most modern tool companies produce across their entire product line. The peasant's weapon. But the billhook had another life, and this one drew blood. With the development of plate armor in the 14th and 15th centuries, European infantry faced a crisis. A spear point deflected off a breastplate. A sword edge bounced off plate. What infantry needed was a weapon that could hook, pull, chop, and thrust all at once. The billhook already did all of those things. The adaptation was almost too obvious. The military bill, as it became known, was essentially a billhook head mounted on an ash pole, roughly 6 feet long. The total weapon weighed about 5 pounds. The curved blade could chop like an axe. A spike added to the top could thrust like a spear, and a smaller back spike, called the fluke, could punch through armor joints. But it was the hook, the feature that made it a peasant's tool that became its most devastating military asset. A skilled billman could use that hook to turn the edge of an opponent's shield, exposing his body to a follow-up strike. He could snag gaps in armor at the armpit or knee. Most devastatingly, he could reach up and drag a heavily armored cavalryman clean off his horse, sending him crashing to the ground in 60 or 70 pounds of plate, where waiting infantry would set upon him before he could stand. Because the bill was simple and cheap to construct, English peasant levies could arm themselves rapidly. A village smith, who had been forging agricultural billhooks his entire life, could produce a military version without new skills or new tools. Over time, the bill became the defining weapon of English infantry. While continental armies favoured the longer pike, English armies preferred the shorter, more versatile bill used in combination with longbowmen. The pike had reach, but if a formation broke and fighting turned to close quarters, the billman had the advantage. Multiple angles of attack. A tool designed for hooking, chopping and pulling. The same motions a hedger used every day. At the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, roughly 6,000 English troops under Henry V faced a French force estimated at up to 30,000. The longbow rightly gets credit for devastating the French cavalry charges. But what happened after the arrows stopped flying tells a deeper story. When combat devolved into hand-to-hand fighting in the narrow, muddy field, English men-at-arms and infantry armed with bills, poleaxes and similar weapons pulled French knights to the ground. The churned mud of Agincourt became a death trap. Armoured men who fell could not stand. They were crushed by their own falling allies or suffocated face down in the mire under the weight of their own plate. The hook that pruned vines in peacetime dragged armoured men to their deaths in war. There is a barn in central Pennsylvania that was built in 1687. The oak beams holding its roof are 337 years old. They are still straight, and if you run your fingers across them, you can feel the marks. Rhythmic, scalloped, deliberate, like the surface of a frozen lake. 300 miles south, there is a storage warehouse built in 2006. The engineered lumber in its roof is already warping. The glue joints are separating. The building will be condemned before it turns 30. Same wood, same climate, same gravity, different tools. Open your garage right now and count. A circular saw, a jigsaw, a hand plane, a chisel set, a draw knife, a router, 6 tools, 8, 10. The man who hewed those 1687 beams owned 1 tool, not 6, not 8, 1. It was not an axe, it was older than the axe. Every civilization that ever shaped wood invented a version of it independently. Egypt, Rome, Scandinavia, Japan, the Pacific. And sometime around 1920, it vanished from the Western construction site and was replaced by the 6 to 10 tools in your garage. Its name is the adze. And what it did with a single swing is something your power tools still cannot do. The marks that outlasted empires. If you have ever walked through an old building and felt that the wood looked different, you were right. The difference is not the wood. The difference is how the surface was made. Modern lumber comes off a planer as a polished, dimensional rectangle. Every surface is flat. Every corner is square. It looks clean, it looks engineered, and it will rot in 40 years because every one of those perfectly flat surfaces traps moisture in the same place every time. Pre-industrial beams look nothing like that. The surface is rippled. The marks run across the grain, not with it. They are shallow and overlapping like scales on a fish. Builders call this hewn timber. It is the signature of the adze. Those ripples are not decoration. They are the reason the beam is still standing. Water that lands on a flat surface pools. Water that lands on a rippled surface runs off and dries unevenly, which means the beam dries faster, rots slower, and moves less when the seasons change. Wood scientists have a name for the failure mode of modern beams. They call it differential shrinkage. A flat milled surface expands and contracts at the same rate across its entire face, so when the beam dries, it cracks in long straight lines. A hewn surface expands and contracts in a random pattern of shallow pockets, and the stress is absorbed across hundreds of tiny ridges instead of concentrated along one failure point. This is why a 300-year-old hewn beam shows no major cracks and a 30-year-old glulam beam shows a split you can put your hand into. The first adze marks in the archaeological record are older than writing. stone blades ground to a cutting edge, lashed to wooden hafts with sinew or leather. Archaeologists have found them in Neolithic sites across Europe, Asia, and the Pacific. By the time the Egyptians were building the pyramids, the adze had copper and bronze blades. It is carved into tomb walls. It appears in the hand of craftsmen in paintings. The Egyptian word for chosen was written with an adze symbol. It was so fundamental to their civilization that they turned the tool itself into a hieroglyph. Rome inherited it. Vikings perfected it. Japanese temple carpenters never stopped using it. And for 7,000 years, one tool with one moving part built almost every wooden structure that mattered. Something here does not add up. A tool that every civilization on Earth independently invented, used for 70 centuries, and refined to a level of precision that still stands up in buildings today, that tool does not vanish because it was primitive. Primitive tools do not last 7,000 years. Primitive tools are replaced in 200, so what was the adze actually doing? And why could nothing else do it? Before we go further, take a second and guess. If you had to shape a 30-foot oak log into a square beam using one hand tool, what would you reach for? An axe? A saw? A chisel? Hold that answer. You are about to find out why the right answer is none of them. The tool every civilization invented. Here is the part that historians argue about and the rest of us should find strange. The adze was not brought to civilization by trade. It was not spread by conquest. It appears fully formed in places that had no contact with each other. The stone-bladed adzes from Neolithic Scandinavia look almost identical to the greenstone adzes of prehistoric New Zealand, made on an island that did not see a European ship until the 1700s. Pacific Islanders on Henderson Island, where there was no workable stone at all, carved adze blades out of giant clam shells. In rural Africa, iron adzes are still being forged today for the same tasks their stone ancestors performed 10,000 years ago. When a tool is invented independently on every continent, by cultures that never spoke to each other, you are not looking at a fashion. You are looking at a solution to a universal problem. The problem was this. Wood is a fibrous material that runs in one direction. If you want to split it, you attack it along the grain. That is what an axe is for. If you want to cut across it, you reach for a saw. But there is a third task that is harder than either of those, and it is the task that actually builds things. You need to shape a curved or flat surface across the grain of the wood without splitting it, without breaking the fibers, and without removing too much material at once. You need to pare, not chop. You need control, not force. An axe cannot do this. The blade is parallel to the handle, and every swing splits along the grain instead of across it. A saw cannot do this either. It removes material in a line, not a surface. A chisel can, but only one tiny bite at a time, and driving it requires a separate tool to strike with. Every major woodworking culture on Earth hit the same wall, and every single one of them independently arrived at the same answer. Rotate the blade 90 degrees. The 90 degrees secret. This is the thing that makes the adze one of the most underrated machines in the history of human engineering. And it is hiding in a detail most people never notice. Take an axe. The cutting edge runs in line with the handle. When you swing, the blade travels along the axis of the haft, splitting the wood with the grain. Force goes into separation. Now take that same blade and rotate it 90 degrees. The edge is now perpendicular to the handle, crossing it, not following it. When you swing, something completely different happens. The blade no longer splits the wood. It pares a thin shaving off the surface cleanly in a controlled arc, moving across the grain instead of along it. This sounds like a small change. It is not. It is the difference between chopping down a tree and smoothing a table. That one rotation converts a tool of brute separation into a tool of precision shaping, and because the blade is now arriving at the wood in a sweeping motion instead of a splitting motion, the adze can do things no axe can do. It can hollow out the inside of a canoe. It can smooth a beam flat enough to lay a floor on. It can carve a notch into a log with enough accuracy that two logs stacked together will hold a house up for 400 years without a single nail. The physicist's way of saying it is this. An axe converts kinetic energy into wedge force. An adze converts kinetic energy into a shearing action across the grain fibers. Shearing is how you cut wood without destroying it. Every modern woodworking tool that shapes rather than splits, the hand plane, the chisel, the router, the draw knife, is built on the same principle. The adzer was the first tool in human history to use it, and for most of our history it was the only one. There is a second secret that most people miss. The traditional way to use a long-handled adzer is not to stand in front of the log. It is to stand directly on top of it, feet shoulder-width apart, the log running between your legs. The blade swings down and toward your own feet. This sounds insane the first time you see it, and every carpenter who has ever used one has had the same first reaction. But the geometry is the reason it works. Because the blade is arriving at the wood on a descending arc that ends near your own body, you have complete visual control over where the edge lands. You can see the grain, you can see the cut, you can feel the bite. Every modern tool that tries to replicate this, the bench plane, the benchtop jointer, the shaper, has to clamp the wood down and move the tool across it at eye level, which takes away the feedback that makes the adzer accurate in the first place. The tool that looks the most primitive is actually the one that gives the carpenter the most information about what the wood is doing. If this changed how you think about what primitive actually means, a quick like helps this video reach more people who still believe old tools were crude. So when you look at that 300-year-old barn beam, what you are seeing is not rough-hewn work that has somehow survived. You are seeing the output of a precision instrument. The ripples are not imperfections. They are the fingerprint of the shear. Each scallop is one controlled swing, removing exactly the amount of material the carpenter wanted, from exactly the direction he wanted, leaving a surface that sheds water for centuries instead of trapping it for decades. This is not a relic. This is engineering. 5 tools in one hand. Here is where the story gets interesting for anyone who owns a workshop. The adze is not one tool. It is a family of tools that share the 90-degree geometry, and the family is large enough that a single medieval or colonial carpenter could do with 2 or 3 adzes what you currently do with most of your garage. Start with the flat carpenter's adze. The blade is straight and wide. Swing it across the top of a rough log, and it removes material in long, flat arcs. This is a hand plane. It levels beams, smooths floorboards, and takes a rough sawn timber down to a finished surface. A skilled hewer could flatten one face of a 30-foot log in roughly 1 hour. Your modern thickness planer cannot take a log that long in the first place. Now change the blade to a curved one. The cutting edge is hollowed out in the middle, called a lipped or gutter adze. Swing it, and it carves a concave channel. This is a gouge. This is how the Polynesians hollowed out canoes from single logs. This is how coopers shaped the inside of wooden barrels. This is how medieval carpenters cut rain gutters into roof beams. Change the blade again to a smaller curved one, and the same tool becomes a bowl carving adze. A spoon maker in 14th century England and a furniture maker in 20th century Japan would reach for almost the same object. Put a lip on the side of the blade and you have a notching adze. This is the one that built log cabins. When you see those perfect dovetail corners where 2 logs cross at the corner of a cabin, corners so tight you cannot slide a knife between them, that precision came from a lipped adze, guided by hand, notching a joint that would bear the weight of a roof for 3 centuries without a single fastener. Shrink the whole tool down. Put it on a short handle you can swing with one hand, and you have a debarking adze. This is a draw knife. It strips the outer bark off a log in clean, continuous sweeps. Log cabin builders used it before they shaped the log. Shipbuilders used it on the masts of sailing ships. Today, green woodworkers still reach for it because no power tool produces a cleaner surface on fresh wood. And finally, this is the part that surprises most people. The back of almost every adze head is a flat striking face, a pole. Some versions have a pin, which means the same tool that shapes the wood can also drive a wooden peg into a joint. One tool for shaping, one tool for fastening. The hammer is built into the adze. Count the replacements: hand plane, gouge, bowl carver, notching tool, draw knife, hammer. That is 6 modern tools inside one blade family. A carpenter in 1687 did the entire shaping pipeline of a barn with what he could carry on his belt. Your garage does the same job with a wall of stacked plastic cases and extension cords. Run the numbers. A mid-range modern set of those 6 tools, a hand plane, a bench chisel set, a router, a draw knife, a carving gouge and a framing hammer will run you between $400 and $800, weigh roughly 20 pounds combined, and require electricity for at least 2 of the 6. A hand-forged adze from a working American blacksmith runs around $200, weighs 4.5 pounds, and runs on the carpenter's own arm. This is the part that changes how the whole history looks. The adze did not survive for 7,000 years because people had no alternatives. The adze survived for 7,000 years because it was the alternative, a single integrated tool that solved a problem modern industry had to split into 6 separate machines to solve worse. The tool that died in 1 generation. So how does a tool that built every major wooden structure in human history, from Egyptian furniture to Viking longships to the barns still standing in Pennsylvania, disappear from the Western construction site in less than 40 years? The answer is not that a better tool came along. The answer is that a different business model came along. Between about 1890 and 1930, the American lumber industry made a decision. Instead of selling whole logs to carpenters who would shape them on site, the industry would pre-shape the wood at the sawmill. Logs would be cut into standardized rectangles, 2x4s, 2x6s, 2x8s, before they ever reached a job site. The carpenter would no longer hew, he would assemble. The new building method had a name. It was called balloon framing, and after it, platform framing. Both systems were designed to be built entirely from pre-milled interchangeable pieces. No hewing, no shaping, no craftsmanship required at the site. The whole house was a kit. This was faster, it was cheaper, and it required no skill. A man with a hammer, a saw, and a week of training could build a house out of dimensional lumber. A man with an adze needed years of apprenticeship to hew a beam straight. Dimensional lumber also sold more volume. A log that produces 1 hand-hewn beam produces 4 milled studs. For the mill, this was obvious progress. For the carpenter, it was the end of a craft. By the 1940s, the adze had vanished from the American building site. The tool that had built Rome, Constantinople, the Mayflower, and every colonial town in New England was being sold as an antique in junk shops for a few dollars. But here is the part the lumber industry did not anticipate. Dimensional lumber is weaker than hand-hewn timber. It has to be, because the grain is cut, not followed. The flat surfaces trap moisture. The standardized joints require metal fasteners, nails, screws, bolts, brackets, every one of which is a point of failure. A modern framed house is held together by its hardware. A hand-hewn timber frame is held together by its geometry. That is why the 1687 barn is still standing, and the 2006 warehouse will not make it to 2050. And here is the irony nobody talks about. The last place on Earth where adzes are still used every day at professional scale is Japan. The temple carpenters of Kyoto and Nara, called Miyadeku, maintain and restore wooden temples that are between 800 and 1300 years old. They do this using the same adzes their predecessors used when those temples were first built. When a beam needs to be replaced, they replace it by hand with an adze because no power tool on Earth produces a surface that matches the original. The old surface sheds water correctly. The new surface, if milled, would not. Modern Japan, the country of industrial robotics and precision manufacturing, keeps its most valuable cultural structures standing with a tool that was obsolete in the West a century ago. That is not tradition. That is engineering. If this kind of buried craft knowledge matters to you.
I see the new king is keeping you busy.
He is. I do not know you.
Where will I find the man, Uhtred?
Lord Uhtred will be that way. With the king's guard and the king. Half the townsfolk starved of interest.
Picture a small village, smoke rising from a single glowing forge. No electricity, no machines. But inside that workshop, the future was being hammered into shape. Medieval blacksmiths weren't just tool makers. They were engineers, chemists, and problem solvers, centuries ahead of their time. Their forgotten tricks didn't just make swords. They built bridges, plows, hinges, armor, locks, nails, civilization itself. In this video, we'll uncover the secrets they used to bend fire, air, and iron into power. Some were lost, some still live in metal, and one might surprise you. Hardening without steel. How blacksmiths made iron stronger than it should be. When we think of strength, we think of steel. But in much of medieval Europe, Steel wasn't widely available, especially not the high-carbon uniform kind we know today. So how did blacksmiths create swords that didn't snap, tools that didn't bend, and nails that held up castles? They used iron, but they didn't use it raw. Instead, they mastered a technique called case hardening. The idea was to take soft, wrought iron and infuse it with carbon from the fire, turning just the outer layer into steel while keeping the core flexible. This gave tools and weapons a tough, sharp edge, without making them brittle. To do it, blacksmiths buried the iron in a mixture of charcoal and bone dust, then sealed it in a clay container. They placed it in the forge for hours, sometimes overnight, letting the carbon slowly migrate into the surface of the iron. The result? A blade or tool with a hardened shell, perfect for cutting, striking, or enduring wear. Even without formal chemistry, they knew the signs, the color of the heat, the hiss when quenched, the feel under the hammer. It was science by instinct, developed over centuries of trial, error, and tradition. And when done right, the result was impressive. Axes that stayed sharp, hoes that churned rocky fields, swords that held an edge against bone and armor. They didn't need steel to make things strong, just fire, carbon, and the patience to let the metal tell them when it was ready. The secret alloy recipes, passed only by word of mouth. Today, metallurgy is a science taught in labs, backed by datasheets and formulas. But in the medieval forge, the blacksmith science was oral, experimental, and fiercely guarded. Some of the most powerful metal combinations of the era weren't written down. They were passed from master to apprentice, whispered during long hours at the anvil, tested by eye and ear, and many of these techniques have been lost, simply because no one outside the forge ever knew they existed. One famous example? The creation of black bronze, an alloy of copper, tin, and sometimes silver or arsenic used for making bells, weapon parts, or ornate fittings. The precise ratios were kept secret, varying by region and even by family. Some blacksmiths added charred bones, eggshells, or crushed ice seashells to change hardness or color. Others experimented with river sand, soot, or salt to affect how the metals mixed during casting. These were empirical recipes, learned by feel, not formula. The color of the molten metal, the speed of its flow, the sound it made as it cooled. For outsiders, it looked like magic. For blacksmiths, it was memory embedded in the metal. Keeping these recipes secret wasn't just about pride. It was about power. A smith who could forge better nails, sharper sickles, or more resonant bells had leverage in the village, with the church, even with the military. And because they rarely wrote anything down, entire technologies disappeared when a single smith died without an apprentice. Some say that's tragic. Others say it's poetic, because in the medieval world, knowledge wasn't published, it was forged. Every village relied on the smith more than the lord. In medieval society, lords ruled by title, priests ruled by faith. But the one person a village couldn't survive without was the blacksmith. Forget the glamour of knights and nobility. The blacksmith was the one who made daily life possible. Every hinge, nail, plow, horseshoe, axe, chain, and lock passed through the forge before it reached the world. And if the forge went cold, the village stalled. A farmer couldn't harvest without tools. A carpenter couldn't build without nails. Even the baker needed iron hooks, pans, and door latches. Soldiers came for armor repairs. Monasteries needed bells, grates, and candle molds. Everyone needed the smith. But it wasn't just about products. The blacksmith also controlled the means of repair, an even more valuable skill in a world where replacement was rare and nothing went to waste. A broken tool wasn't thrown away. It was reforged, reshaped, retempered. That made the smith the beating heart of sustainability, centuries before the word existed. And while lords taxed the land and enforced law, blacksmiths worked with their hands and earned their power through trust. A good smith had authority without needing armor. If he stopped working, the village would feel it in days. If he left, they might not recover for months. Some villages even exempted blacksmiths from military service. Others gave them land or privileges just to keep them close. Because deep down, everyone knew. A sword is just a symbol. A forge is survival. The portable forge. How armies brought firepower on the road. When armies marched, they didn't just carry weapons and armor, they carried forges. Imagine an army far from home, their weapons battered and broken, their tools worn thin. With no metal to spare, the soldiers would have to rely on a portable forge to keep fighting. These were mobile forges designed to be carried on carts, wagons, or even horseback, so the army could repair, forge, and craft while on the move. The process was simple yet brilliant. A small forge was set up wherever the army camped, burning wood or charcoal. Blacksmiths, often traveling with the unit, would heat metal over the flames and hammer it into shape, just like in a full-scale workshop. Sometimes, the forge was little more than a box with a small fire, surrounded by tools and anvils, but it was enough to keep the army's weapons sharp and their gear intact. This mobile forge was not just a luxury, it was a necessity. Armies in the field couldn't afford to stop and return home for repairs. And in battles, weapons got broken fast. A sword could crack, a spear could bend. Horseshoes were constantly in need of replacing. Without a forge on hand, an army would be weakened by its own equipment. And by having the forge on the road, medieval armies could march for weeks without having to worry about losing their edge, literally and figuratively. And while a lord or noble would command the army, it was the blacksmith who ensured it could actually keep fighting. Even more impressive was how blacksmiths and armies had multifunctional skills. They didn't just work with metal. Some were also woodworkers, repairing wagons, carts, and siege engines. Others worked with leather, patching up armor, tents, and saddles. A knight might have commanded the troops, but it was the blacksmith who kept them fighting. Edge geometry and the science of blade sharpness before science. Long before microscopes or metallurgy textbooks, medieval blacksmiths were already mastering the science of sharpness. They didn't need to understand molecules or atomic structure. They had trial, error, and instinct sharpened by generations. One of their greatest unspoken skills was shaping the geometry of a blade. It wasn't enough to make something pointy. A blade had to balance cutting power, durability, and flexibility, depending on the task. And that came down to how it was forged and angled. Need a knife to slice through cloth? You gave it a narrow, razor-thin edge. Need a sword to cut through bone and armor? You added a thicker spine, a more obtuse angle, less sharp, but far stronger. Axes had wide wedge-shaped bevels to split wood and bone. Sickles used a curved blade that pulled into crops with less effort. Blacksmiths knew which shapes worked because they saw the results, and they adjusted accordingly. Over time, these smiths developed an internal catalog of edge types: convex, hollow ground, Scandi style, asymmetric edges, all before those terms even existed. They watched how a blade bit into leather, how long it held an edge, how it broke when misused. Sharpening wasn't just about the final polish. It was about the soul of the tool, the shape that determined whether it would last an hour or a lifetime. And it wasn't guesswork. It was a language of steel, passed hand to hand. A cut too smooth meant it would dull fast. A cut too jagged meant the edge would chip. There was a sweet spot, one you couldn't see, only feel. Today, we use CAD software and metallurgical analysis to test edge performance. But blacksmiths in the Middle Ages did it with nothing more than a whetstone, a hammer, and experience passed down like treasure. Repurposing broken tools. Nothing was ever truly trash. In the medieval world, metal wasn't just valuable, it was sacred. And to a blacksmith, a broken tool wasn't the end of its story. It was just raw material waiting to be reborn. Iron was expensive. Mining and smelting it took enormous effort, and transporting it across long distances was dangerous and slow. So when a sickle cracked, a chisel snapped, or a blade dulled beyond repair, it wasn't discarded. It was reworked, reshaped, reforged. A sword that broke in battle might become two knives. A shattered horseshoe could be straightened and reforged into nails or hinges. Even worn-out tools were refused into smaller, more precise instruments, like awls, hooks, or arrowheads. In many ways, the forge was less a factory and more a metal recycling plant, long before that term existed. And the blacksmith was a master of turning waste into something useful again. This practice wasn't just practical, it was essential. A village might go months without fresh metal. If something broke, they couldn't wait. The local smith had to make do with what he had. That's why even scrap piles were curated, sorted by size, shape, and thickness, ready to be melted or reworked when needed. Some smiths even specialized in second forging, the art of working with metal that had already lived another life. These pieces had memory, stress lines, work-hardened edges, carbon inconsistencies. But the smith knew how to read them, where to strike, when to soften, how to give them new purpose without pushing them too far. In a world where supply was uncertain and waste was dangerous, nothing was thrown away unless it was ash. And even then, sometimes they'd use the ash too. The bellows system. How controlled airflow changed everything. If fire was the heart of the forge, air was its breath. And once medieval blacksmiths learned to control it, everything changed. The invention and refinement of the bellows system wasn't just a convenience. It was a revolution. Before bellows, fires burned at the mercy of weather and wood. With them, blacksmiths could create controlled high-temperature flames, hot enough to melt, weld, and transform metal in ways previously impossible. A single-chamber bellows could push short bursts of air into the coals, but the real magic happened when smiths developed dual-chamber or double-acting bellows. These allowed for a continuous stream of airflow, no more waiting for the fire to catch. The temperature became consistent. The forge could stay red-hot for hours, and suddenly new possibilities emerged. Stronger tools, sharper blades, cleaner welds, and even more complex techniques like pattern welding, carburization, and forge welding became not just possible, but reliable. Controlling airflow meant controlling the character of the fire itself. A hotter flame made iron more malleable. A shorter, sharper burst allowed for tempering. Smiths learned to read the flame the same way a sailor reads the wind. They adjusted the bellows by rhythm and sound. Too much air? The fire would roar and waste fuel. Too little? The metal wouldn't respond. Some master smiths could identify the forge temperature by the color of the metal in the coals and match it to the breath of the bellows. That's not guesswork. That's generational skill passed through thousands of burns and blows. And beyond the forge, the same bellows technology led to advances in glass making, smelting, and even early engines centuries later. When medieval smiths learned to control the air, they didn't just change their fire, they changed the future. Blacksmiths as early engineers, fixing more than just metal. To most, the blacksmith was the one who forged the blade or shoed the horse. But in truth, he was the village engineer long before that title ever existed. Need to lift something heavy? The blacksmith built the pulley system. Water wheel not turning? He reworked the axle pin and reshaped the gear teeth. Need a new lock, hinge, trap door, wagon axle, or drawbridge chain? Guess who figured it out? Blacksmiths didn't just understand metal. They understood motion, leverage, heat, pressure, tension, and sometimes even fluid dynamics, just without the terminology. They crafted solutions with what was available, making tools to fix tools, and often inventing mechanisms on the fly to solve problems that had never been written down. In many rural areas, blacksmiths were called to advise on everything from agricultural systems to village infrastructure. They'd reinforce mills, brace carts, rebuild broken parts of plows, and even design custom equipment for harvesting, cooking, or defense. In towns with no architects, no machinists, and no blueprints, the blacksmith was the one who could see in metal what others couldn't. And often, his value to the community wasn't just in what he made, but in what he could figure out under pressure. His forge became a workshop of ideas. People brought problems, not just broken tools, and he gave them designs, repairs, and working systems crafted by fire and instinct. So yes, the blacksmith made swords, but he also made machines. He was the technician, the builder, the innovator. And in many ways, the civilization we admire today was built not just with muscle, but with the mind of the man at the anvil. The rituals of the forge, myths, superstition, and skill. To outsiders, the forge was a place of labor, but to those who worked within it, the forge was sacred ground. The blacksmith's fire wasn't just heat, it was life, transformation, and danger. It turned ore into tools, tools into power, and mistakes into scars. That's why across medieval Europe, the forge was surrounded by rituals, taboos, and superstitions, some of them deeply symbolic, others purely practical, but all respected. In many regions, it was bad luck to forge iron on certain feast days, especially around solstices or equinoxes. Some smiths refused to quench blades in cold water on holy days. Others said never to begin a forge cycle without speaking the name of a saint. Often Saint Clement or Saint Eligius, patron saints of blacksmiths. Apprentices weren't just hired, they were tested and initiated, sometimes through symbolic trials. Some traditions had them hold tongs in fire without flinching, or hammer a red-hot bar into shape blindfolded to prove their focus and respect for the flame. Certain forges were said to be alive, and smiths believed that metal itself could refuse to work if mistreated. A blade that bent or cracked repeatedly was said to be angry. A piece of iron that sparked too early might be cursed. These weren't just superstitions. They were the language of experience, wrapped in myth to warn and instruct. Even the act of sharpening a sword carried symbolic weight. Some smiths whispered protective prayers or old phrases while tempering, not because they believed in magic, but because they believed in tradition. And tradition mattered, because when your entire village depended on what came out of your fire, you took every precaution, every habit, and every whisper seriously. Skill made the forge powerful, but ritual made it respected. How blacksmiths quietly powered farming, war, and trade. When we think of medieval history, we picture kings, knights, crusades, and castles. But behind every blade of a plow, every hinge of a gate, every edge of a sword, there was a blacksmith. Blacksmiths weren't just support workers, they were infrastructure. They powered the three engines that drove medieval civilization: farming, war, and trade. In farming, they were indispensable. Without forged hoes, plows, scythes, and sickles, there was no harvest. Without horseshoes, ox yokes, or reinforced wagon wheels, there was no transport. The food system depended on metal, and metal depended on the smith. In war, their role was obvious, but deeper than it seems. Yes, they made swords and armor, but more than that, they repaired them after battle. They kept armies moving with tools, nails, wheel braces, and portable forges. Siege weapons, smith-built. Arrowheads, smith-crafted. Chains, gates, drawbridges, all the metal behind the glory, forged in smoke and sweat. In trade, their impact was subtle but enormous. Locks to protect goods, scales to measure them, carts to move them. And iron was one of the most valuable trade goods itself, shipped across Europe as currency in the form of tools. A well-made axe or horseshoe was worth more than coin in many regions. Blacksmiths didn't write laws, they didn't win battles, but nothing worked without them. They were the quiet power behind the progress, the heat behind the harvest, the fire behind the fortress, and the hinge on which medieval life swung. They weren't kings, they weren't warriors.
Imagine a world without modern machines, factories, or advanced technology. Yet in the heart of medieval villages, master blacksmiths forged weapons and tools that shaped the fate of entire kingdoms. But how did they do it? How could a simple piece of iron be transformed into a razor-sharp sword capable of cutting through armor? Today, we'll uncover the secrets of medieval blacksmiths, from selecting the perfect metal to the techniques that made their blades deadly. And by the end, you'll discover the mystery behind legendary swords that seemed indestructible. The art of the blacksmith in the Middle Ages. If there was one essential profession in any medieval village, it was the blacksmith. Without them, there would be no tools for farmers, nails for carpenters, horseshoes for knights, or weapons for soldiers. But being a blacksmith wasn't just about hammering iron into shape. It was a true art, passed down through generations, and mastered only by the most skilled. Unlike today, where anyone can buy mass-produced tools or weapons, in the Middle Ages, every piece was handcrafted, and a blacksmith's work could determine the fate of many. In small villages, they made everything from household utensils to iron fittings for doors and windows. In larger cities and castles, specialized blacksmiths focused solely on forging weapons and armor for armies. The path to becoming a blacksmith was long. A young apprentice would start with basic tasks like fueling the forge and organizing materials. Under the watchful eye of a master, they would then learn to shape small objects before finally being allowed to craft something larger, such as a blade or a tool. This training could take years before they were recognized as master blacksmiths and allowed to open their own workshops. Beyond manual skill, a good blacksmith needed deep knowledge of metals. Not all iron was the same, and choosing the wrong one could result in weak tools or ineffective weapons. With experience, they could identify the quality of the metal just by the sound it made when hammered, a testament to their mastery, even without modern technology. Raw materials and choosing the perfect metal. A blacksmith's skill meant nothing without the right metal. In the Middle Ages, iron was the foundation of nearly every tool and weapon, but acquiring high-quality metal was no easy task. Unlike today, where refined steel is readily available, medieval blacksmiths had to work with whatever metal they could obtain, often through mining, trade, or repurposing old iron objects. Iron sources and extraction methods. Most of the iron used in medieval Europe came from bog iron ore deposits, or recycled metal from broken tools and weapons. Bog iron, found in marshy areas, was one of the easiest sources to collect, but it required extensive refining to be usable. Meanwhile, iron ore had to be mined from deep underground, a process that required considerable effort and manpower. Once extracted, raw iron needed to be smelted in a bloomery, a type of furnace that heated the ore with charcoal to separate the usable iron from impurities. However, medieval smelting was far from perfect, and the resulting iron was often filled with impurities. Skilled blacksmiths had to refine it further by repeatedly heating and hammering the metal to remove excess slag, a process known as puddling or forging out impurities. The difference between wrought iron, steel, and cast iron. Not all metals were equal, and a blacksmith had to choose carefully depending on what they were forging. Wrought iron, malleable and resistant to rust, this was ideal for tools, chains, and everyday objects. Steel. Created by adding carbon to iron, steel was much stronger and was the preferred material for swords, knives, and armor. However, producing high-quality steel was a rare and valuable skill. Cast iron. Though used in later periods, medieval blacksmiths rarely worked with cast iron, as it was brittle and difficult to forge. Because there were no chemical tests or microscopes, blacksmiths relied on experience and intuition to determine the quality of their metal. By listening to the sound of the hammer against the iron and observing how it reacted to heat, they could judge whether a piece was suitable for a durable sword or a sturdy tool. The forging process without modern machines. Forging metal without modern machinery was a labor-intensive and highly skilled process. Medieval blacksmiths had to rely on heat, muscle, and experience to shape raw iron into useful tools and deadly weapons. The key to their success lay in their mastery of fire, hammer, and anvil, three essential elements that defined their craft. The medieval forge. Heat and fire control. The heart of any blacksmith's workshop was the forge, a furnace used to heat metal until it became malleable. Unlike today's industrial forges, which use controlled gas flames, medieval forges relied on charcoal as fuel. Charcoal burned hotter and cleaner than regular wood, making it ideal for reaching the high temperatures needed to work iron. To maintain these high temperatures, blacksmiths used bellows, large hand-operated air pumps that increased oxygen flow to the fire, making it burn hotter. A skilled blacksmith knew exactly how much air to pump to keep the metal at just the right temperature. Too cold, and it wouldn't be workable. Too hot, and it could burn or weaken. Hammering and shaping the metal. Once heated, the glowing metal was placed on an anvil and shaped using a variety of hammers and chisels. This process required not only strength but precision. The blacksmith would repeatedly reheat and hammer the iron, slowly refining its shape with each strike. Different hammering techniques allowed blacksmiths to control the thickness, strength, and flexibility of the final product. Some of the most common methods included drawing out, stretching the metal to make it longer and thinner, upsetting, thickening the metal by compressing it, bending and twisting, shaping the metal into curves and spirals, useful for decorative or functional elements, quenching and hardening. Once the desired shape was achieved, the blacksmith had to harden the metal through quenching, rapidly cooling it in water or oil. This process locked in the shape and increased durability, but if done incorrectly, it could make the metal too brittle. Despite lacking modern tools, medieval blacksmiths perfected these techniques through centuries of trial and error, ensuring that their weapons and tools were strong, reliable, and long-lasting. Crafting essential tools, knives, axes, and farming equipment. Before a blacksmith could forge mighty swords or armor, they had to master the creation of everyday tools. In medieval society, knives, axes, and farming equipment were just as important as weapons, as they sustained daily life and kept communities functioning. Knives. The blacksmith's first masterpiece. A knife was often the first blade a blacksmith learned to forge, as it was small but required precise technique. Knives were essential for cooking, crafting, hunting, and self-defense, making them one of the most commonly produced items in a forge. The process of making a knife involved heating and shaping a small iron or steel bar on the anvil, drawing out the blade to refine its edge, grinding and sharpening the cutting edge using a whetstone or manual grinding wheel, tempering the blade to balance hardness and flexibility. Handles were often made from wood, bone, or even wrapped leather, ensuring a firm grip for various tasks. Axes, essential for survival and combat. Axes were another crucial tool used for chopping wood, clearing land, and even as a weapon in battle. Unlike knives, an axe head had to be heavier and more robust, requiring careful forging to ensure it wouldn't crack under impact. To make an axe, blacksmiths would forge a thick wedge-shaped blade, sometimes wrapping and welding the metal to form a socket for the handle. Sharpen and harden the edge through a process of differential tempering. Attach a sturdy wooden handle, often made of ash or oak, for durability. Farming equipment, the backbone of medieval society. The survival of medieval villages depended on efficient farming, which meant blacksmiths were constantly making and repairing tools such as plowshares to cut through soil, sickles and scythes to harvest crops, horseshoes to protect workhorses from injury. Because of the demanding nature of farm work, these tools had to be strong but not brittle, requiring the blacksmith to carefully balance hardness and flexibility in the metal. Even though weapons are often romanticized, blacksmiths spent more time crafting these everyday tools, proving that their role extended far beyond warfare. Forging medieval weapons, swords, spears, and war axes. While blacksmiths crafted countless tools for daily life, their most respected and sought-after work was undoubtedly the forging of weapons. Whether for knights, soldiers, or mercenaries, a well-crafted blade could mean the difference between life and death on the battlefield. But without modern machines, how did medieval blacksmiths shape iron and steel into deadly weapons? The art of swordsmithing, from raw metal to deadly blade. Forging a sword was one of the most complex tasks a blacksmith could undertake. The process required skill, patience, and a deep understanding of metallurgy. The steps to making a sword included forging the blade. A steel bar was heated and hammered into the rough shape of a sword. To ensure flexibility, some blacksmiths layered different types of iron and steel, creating composite blades. Shaping and fullering. The blacksmith would refine the blade, adding a fuller, a central groove, to reduce weight without sacrificing strength. Quenching and tempering. After heating the blade to a high temperature, it was rapidly cooled in water or oil to harden the metal. However, this could make the blade brittle, so it was reheated at a lower temperature to restore some flexibility. Sharpening and polishing. The edges were carefully honed, and the surface was polished to remove imperfections. A well-made medieval sword was not just a weapon, it was a finely balanced tool of war, capable of cutting through armor while withstanding powerful blows. Spears and war axes, simple but deadly. Not every soldier carried a sword. In fact, many medieval warriors relied on spears and axes, which were easier to produce and just as effective in battle. Spears were relatively simple to forge. A long, narrow iron blade was attached to a wooden shaft. However, some blacksmiths reinforced the metal tip with steel for added strength. War axes were heavier and more brutal than everyday axes, often featuring a bearded blade with an extended lower edge to hook onto enemy shields or armor. While swords were symbols of nobility, spears and axes were the weapons of the common soldier, proving that even the simplest blacksmith's work could shape the outcome of wars. Hardening and tempering, the secrets of a strong blade. A sword or tool was only as good as its durability. If a blade was too soft, it would bend or dull easily. If too hard, it could shatter upon impact. This is where medieval blacksmiths relied on their most critical techniques, hardening and tempering. Without modern measuring tools or controlled heat environments, they perfected these methods through centuries of trial and error. The hardening process, quenching in water or oil. Once a blade had been forged into shape, it needed to be hardened. This was done by heating the metal to a high temperature, often a glowing orange or yellow, and then rapidly cooling it, a process called quenching. Water quenching, faster cooling resulting in a very hard but brittle blade. Oil quenching, slower cooling, making the blade slightly softer but much tougher and less prone to breaking. Blacksmiths could judge the temperature of the metal just by its color, a skill that took years to master. If the blade was overheated before quenching, it could warp or crack, ruining hours of work. Tempering, achieving the perfect balance. After hardening, the metal was often too brittle for battle. To fix this, the blacksmith would temper it by reheating the blade at a lower temperature and letting it cool gradually. This process relieved some of the internal stress, making the blade more flexible and impact-resistant. By mastering these techniques, medieval blacksmiths ensured that their weapons could withstand battle conditions, proving that advanced metallurgy existed long before modern science. The blacksmith's tools, crafting the craftsman's arsenal. A blacksmith's success depended not only on skill, but also on the quality of their tools. Since there were no factories to mass-produce equipment, blacksmiths had to forge their own hammers, tongs, anvils, and chisels, the very tools they needed to shape metal into weapons and tools for others. The anvil, the blacksmith's workbench. A well-made anvil was the foundation of any blacksmith's workshop. Made of wrought iron or steel, its hard surface allowed metal to be hammered into shape efficiently. Medieval anvils often had a flat working surface for general shaping, a horn, curved end, for bending metal, a hardy hole for inserting different shaping tools. Since a good anvil could last generations, they were rarely replaced and were often considered the most valuable item in a forge. Hammers and tongs, extensions of the blacksmith's hands. A blacksmith used different hammers depending on the type of work. Cross-peen hammers, used for drawing out metal into thin shapes. Straight-peen hammers, ideal for refining edges. Sledgehammers, heavy and used for large-scale forging. Tongs were just as important, as handling hot metal with bare hands was impossible. Blacksmiths had a variety of tongs to hold different shapes and sizes of metal securely. Chisels, punches, and other specialty tools. To carve details, make holes, or add decorative patterns, blacksmiths used chisels to cut and engrave metal, punches to create holes for rivets or decorative effects, files and rasps for smoothing rough edges and fine-tuning blades. Despite the lack of modern precision tools, medieval blacksmiths crafted intricate, functional, and durable items, proving that their expertise could compensate for the absence of industrial technology. Myths, secrets, and lost techniques of medieval blacksmithing. Throughout history, blacksmithing has been surrounded by mystery and legend. Some techniques were closely guarded secrets, while others have been lost to time, leaving modern historians and metalworkers searching for answers. The mystery of Damascus steel. One of the most famous lost techniques is the production of Damascus steel, a type of blade known for its wavy patterns, extreme sharpness, and durability. These swords were said to cut through other weapons with ease, yet the exact method for making them remains unknown. Historians believe that Damascus steel was made using high-carbon steel with unique forging and tempering methods, but the knowledge was lost sometime in the 18th century. Some modern bladesmiths have tried to recreate it, but no one can say for sure if they have matched the legendary originals. The magic of quenching in blood. One popular myth claims that medieval blacksmiths quenched swords in human or animal blood to give them extra strength. While this may have some basis in reality, the science doesn't support it. The small amount of carbon in blood wouldn't significantly alter the blade's composition. Instead, this legend may have originated from the ritualistic or symbolic aspects of sword making, where sacrificing an animal during forging was seen as giving the weapon a spirit or special power. Hidden techniques of master blacksmiths. Many blacksmithing families passed down their best techniques only through apprenticeships, keeping their knowledge exclusive. Surface hardening techniques that made blades both strong and flexible. Special folding methods to remove impurities and enhance durability. Secret quenching formulas using unknown mixtures of oils, herbs, or minerals. Even today, modern blacksmiths struggle to fully replicate some medieval weapons and tools, proving that these artisans possessed a deep understanding of metalwork long before modern science caught up. The legacy of medieval blacksmiths in the modern world. Although medieval blacksmiths worked without modern tools or machines, their influence can still be seen today. Their techniques laid the foundation for modern metallurgy, and their craftsmanship continues to inspire artisans, historians, and even industrial metalworkers. Traditional blacksmithing still exists even in the age of mass production. Some modern blacksmiths still use medieval techniques to create handcrafted knives, swords, and tools. Many of these artisans study historical methods to ensure authenticity, relying on forges, anvils, and hammers, just as their medieval predecessors did. Organizations and historical reenactment groups, such as the Society for Creative Anachronism, SCA, and HMB, Historical Medieval Battle, help preserve blacksmithing traditions, proving that the art is far from forgotten. Engineering and metallurgy. Lessons from the past. Despite advancements in metalworking, some ancient techniques still surpass modern industrial methods in terms of durability and flexibility. Folded steel techniques, once used in swordsmithing, are now applied in crafting high-end knives and specialty tools. Quenching and tempering processes refined by medieval blacksmiths are still used to harden industrial machinery parts. Hand-forged tools and weapons remain highly valued by collectors and martial artists for their strength and authenticity. The fascination with medieval blacksmithing continues in modern media, from historical documentaries to fantasy and medieval-themed shows. Whether in Game of Thrones, The Witcher, or historical dramas like Vikings, the image of a skilled blacksmith forging powerful weapons remains a symbol of strength.
Open your garage and count the power tools on the wall. A planer, a belt sander, a router. Every one will be landfill before your children finish school, and the company that sold them is counting on it. Now picture an Old English carpenter named Thomas Lane alone in a Shaftesbury workshop over a century ago. No electricity, no motor, no sandpaper. Just a single blade older than the printing press. In the time it takes to boil a kettle, he finished a chair leg so smooth it is still sitting in a museum in Dorset, outperforming anything a modern router can cut. One blade, no cord, no replacement cycle. And for 7 centuries, every carpenter in Europe trusted it above anything else in the shop. The tool is called a draw knife. The reason you have never heard of it is not that it failed, it is that it refused to break. A sharpened one lasts 3 generations. A power planer lasts until the next mortgage cycle, then the bearings burn out and you buy another. That single fact is what killed the draw knife. The physics had nothing to do with it. The business model did. Stay with me. The last tool this medieval blade replaces is the one sitting in most garages right now, collecting dust. The disappearance. Here's the strange part. If you walked into any carpenter's shop in Europe between 1200 and 1900, you would see the same tool hanging on the wall. A curved blade, between 6 and 12 inches long, with 2 wooden handles angled back toward the user. They called it a draw knife because you pulled it, drew it toward your body, across a piece of wood held in a shaving horse. The cut was controlled entirely by your forearms, and every carpenter, cooper, wheelwright, bodger, shipwright, clogger, and farrier owned one. Some owned 3 or 4 of different curvatures, for different work. Then around 1910, it started to vanish. Not because it stopped working, not because someone invented a better blade. It vanished because the first electric planers and belt sanders appeared in American factories, and factories couldn't sell a carpenter one machine, they could sell him a lifetime of them. A draw knife, sharpened properly, lasts 3 generations. A power planer lasts about 15 years, then the bearings go and you buy another one. The math is brutal. A draw knife eliminates 8 tools, 8 cords, 8 motors, 8 replacement cycles. You can see why every trade magazine from 1915 onwards stopped reviewing them. They stopped fitting the business model. And then, by the 1950s, most apprentices had never seen one used properly. By the 1990s, most hardware stores had stopped carrying them entirely. If you ask a 20-year-old carpenter today what a draw knife is, 9 times out of 10, they'll guess it's a type of kitchen tool. It isn't. It's probably the most efficient single piece of metal ever attached to 2 handles. And it does things no power tool can do. The 8 modern tools it replaces. One draw knife, in trained hands, does the work of 8 separate power tools. This is not an exaggeration. It is documented in apprentice manuals from England, Germany, and the American Appalachians dating back to the early 1900s. Let me walk you through the list. 1. The electric planer. A draw knife flattens a round log into a square beam faster than a handheld planer because it takes a deeper, cleaner pass without tear out. The blade reads the grain. The motor cannot. 2. The belt sander. A properly honed draw knife leaves a surface so smooth it needs no sanding. There is a physical reason for this that modern woodworkers rarely hear. The compression of the blade edge actually seals the wood fibre, closing the surface rather than tearing it open. A belt sander shreds the fibres and leaves tiny frayed endings that absorb moisture. A draw knife burnishes the wood. The difference shows up 200 years later when the sanded piece is rotted through and the draw knife piece is still intact. 3. The spindle shaper, chair legs, spoke tapers, pegs, balusters, any shape a spindle shaper carves. A draw knife shapes faster and with zero setup time. No jigs, no fence adjustment, no dust mask. You pick up the blade and cut. 4. The router, rounding edges, cutting chamfers, carving curves into rails and rungs. All of it is the draw knife's native territory. No dust plume, no screaming motor, no smell of burning wood. 5. The jack plane. Long, flat surfaces on rough lumber are slow work for a plane because it has to ride on what it has already flattened. The draw knife cuts across the grain at an angle no plane can achieve, which means it removes material 2 or 3 times faster on the rough pass. The English bodgers working in the beechwoods of Buckinghamshire flatten 16 chair legs an hour this way. A modern shop with a jack plane and a thickness planer manages maybe 12. 6. The spokeshalve. The spokeshalve is itself a smaller draw knife, a miniaturized descendant from the same family. A full-size draw knife replaces it for most curved work, reserving the spokeshalve only for the final 1/8 of an inch of finesse work. Colonial Windsor chairmakers owned both, but the spokeshalve came out only at the end. The draw knife did the real labor. 7. The angle grinder with a flap disc, removing bark, debarking posts, cleaning a rough beam. A draw knife does in 30 seconds what a flap disc does in 5 minutes. No burn marks on the wood, no shower of sparks, no mask. 8. And here is the one that should frustrate anyone who has spent $400 on their most recent tool purchase: the thickness planer. A benchtop thickness planer runs between $400 and $1,200. Every carpenter from 1400 to 1900 did the same job with a shaving horse and a draw knife. No electricity, no replacement blades, no shop space. The shaving horse sits in a corner. The draw knife hangs on a nail above it. That is the entire workstation. 8 tools, 1 blade, built to last 3 generations. Why craftsmen trusted it over any power tool. Now here is the part the power tool industry buried. Medieval and colonial craftsmen did not use the draw knife because they had no other option. They used it because for most jobs it was genuinely faster and genuinely better than anything with a motor. 4 specific reasons explain why. First, feel. A draw knife transmits the grain of the wood directly into your forearms. You can sense when the fiber is running with you or against you, and you adjust the angle of attack mid-stroke. Your body reads the wood the way a musician reads a score. A power planer cannot do this. It hits a knot, the blades jam, a chunk tears out, and you have ruined the beam. A draw knife feels the knot coming 3 inches away and lifts around it. Second, shape. Power tools do straight lines and circles. Everything else is a compromise. A draw knife does every compound curve a human body can intuit, which is every curve found in nature. That is why the same tool shaped ship ribs, wagon axles, chair seats, and scythe handles for 7 centuries. None of those surfaces are cuttable by a single power tool. They need 3 or 4 tools plus a router jig. Or they need 1 draw knife and a pair of trained hands. Third, speed on green wood. This is the detail almost nobody tells you, and it changes everything. Traditional woodworkers worked freshly cut wood, called riven wood, split along the grain while it was still wet. Green wood is dramatically easier to cut than kiln-dried lumber. A draw knife on green oak removes a 1/4 inch of material per stroke, clean. A beam that would take a modern shop an hour of machining is shaped in 20 minutes by a man with a blade. No power tool on the market is calibrated for green wood. Green wood destroys saw teeth within hours. It gums up planer blades and ruins motor bearings. Every medieval craftsman understood this. Every modern craftsman has forgotten it. That single piece of lost knowledge is worth more than most power tools combined. Fourth, and this is the one I want you to remember. A sharp draw knife never slips. A power tool always eventually slips. The blade cuts toward your body, which sounds dangerous until you understand that your forearms are the strongest muscles in the upper body for pulling motion. You have total control because your own body is the governor. A power tool has no governor. It runs at the speed the motor decides, and if your hand slips or the wood catches, the machine does not stop to check on you. The Occupational Safety and Health Administration publishes annual injury data for power woodworking tools. Table saws alone account for more than 30,000 emergency room visits a year in the United States. Ask any cabinet maker over 50 who still has all 10 fingers How many of his old drinking companions can say the same? Modern woodworking researchers have started noticing what medieval carpenters always knew. In 2019, a team at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences compared chair legs shaped by draw knife versus chair legs shaped by industrial spindle turning. The draw knife legs showed 40% higher resistance to splitting after a decade of use. The reason was the sealed fiber surface that only a drawn blade produces. Modern machines, no matter how precise, cannot replicate that seal. They were built to cut. A draw knife was built to finish.